In the quiet, dusty archives of Paris, there lies a peculiar set of documents from the late 18th century. They are not grand treaties or royal decrees, but rather humble death certificates. And on many of them, for the cause of death, a physician has simply written fear. It's a haunting and medically imprecise diagnosis that speaks volumes about the psychological atmosphere of a nation on the brink of profound violent change. We often think of history in terms of battles and laws, of grand figures making grand pronouncements. But what happens when an entire society becomes so consumed by anxiety, suspicion, and terror that its own collective heart begins to fail? How does a nation's soul become so sick that fear itself becomes a certifiable cause of death? This is the unsettling mystery at the heart of the story we are about to explore, the story of the French Revolution. It's a tale that begins not with a bang, but with a long, slow, simmering fever of discontent that would eventually break, transforming the world forever. Tonight, we will journey back to that fevered time, to a world of gilded palaces and starving peasants, of radical ideas and unthinkable violence. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to post your location and local time in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see where everyone is listening from as we begin our journey together into the past. Our story begins in a world that on the surface seemed as eternal and unchanging as the heavens themselves. This was France of the Ancien Régime, the Old Order, a society built upon centuries of tradition, faith, and a deeply ingrained system of hierarchy. It was a world structured like a great pyramid, with God at its apex, the king just below, and the rest of society arranged in descending layers of importance. This structure was formalized into three great social classes, or estates. At the very top was the first estate, the clergy. These were the men of the church, from the humblest parish priest tending to his rural flock to the immensely wealthy and powerful cardinals and archbishops who moved in the highest circles of power. The church was more than just a spiritual institution. It was a state within a state. It owned somewhere between 10 and 15% of all the land in France, collected its own tax, the tithe, from the peasantry, and wielded enormous influence over every aspect of life, from birth to marriage to death. It was the keeper of knowledge, the educator of the young, and the moral authority of the kingdom. To question the church was, in a very real sense, to question the order of the universe itself. Just below them, occupying the second tier of the pyramid, was the second estate, the nobility. These were the descendants of the old feudal lords, a class whose entire identity was rooted in the profession of arms and the ownership of land. They were the dukes, the marquises, and the counts who possessed vast ancestral estates and considered themselves the natural leaders of society. Their privileges were ancient and extensive. They were largely exempt from paying most taxes, a right that stemmed from the old feudal idea that they paid their dues to the kingdom in blood, by leading its armies, rather than in cash. They held a monopoly on the highest offices in the military, the government, and the church. And they enjoyed unique feudal rights, or droits seigneuriaux, over the peasants who lived on their lands. The right to hunt on peasant fields, the right to demand labor for a certain number of days a year, the right to mill their grain at the Lord's mill for a fee. while some of the provincial nobility were relatively poor, clinging to a crumbling chateau and a faded title. The great aristocrats at court lived lives of unimaginable splendor, and then there was everyone else. The third estate. It was a vast, sprawling category that encompassed 97% of the French population. It included the wealthy merchants of the port cities, the lawyers and doctors of the burgeoning middle class, known as the bourgeoisie. It included the urban artisans and shopkeepers, the blacksmiths, the bakers, and the carpenters who filled the bustling, noisy streets of Paris. And far and away, the largest group, it included the 20 million peasants who toiled in the fields, their lives governed by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of their landlords and the tax collector. The third estate was the economic engine of France. They were the ones who produced the food, created the goods, and most importantly, paid almost all of the taxes. From the salt tax to the tithe to the hated délai, a tax on land from which the other two estates were exempt. The burden of financing the kingdom, its endless wars, and its extravagant court fell squarely on their shoulders. There was a popular political cartoon from the era that captured this reality perfectly. It depicted a stooped, elderly peasant with a hoe, carrying on his back a well-fed bishop and a foppishly dressed nobleman. This single image encapsulated the fundamental injustice of the old order. The productive many were being crushed under the weight of the privileged few. The ultimate symbol of this gilded, unequal world was the magnificent Palace of Versailles. Located a dozen miles outside of Paris, it was not merely a royal residence. It was the gravitational center of the entire French universe. Begun by Louis XIV, the Sun King, it had been transformed from a humble hunting lodge into the most opulent and awe-inspiring palace in all of Europe, a breathtaking spectacle of manicured gardens, glittering chandeliers, and the famous Hall of Mirrors. Here, the king presided over a court life that was a masterpiece of political theater. Every moment of the monarch's day, from his waking up to his going to bed, was a public ceremony governed by a labyrinthine set of rules and etiquette. Thousands of nobles vied for the honor of being present at these rituals, competing for a glance from the king, a whispered word, or a favorable position in the room. This was by design. The Sun King had deliberately created this suffocating, narcissistic world to domesticate his powerful nobility by luring them to Versailles and trapping them in this endless cycle of ceremony and social intrigue. He had transformed them from dangerous, independent feudal lords into fawning courtiers, their power entirely dependent on royal favor. The great mystery for historians is how deeply the French people believed in this system. For centuries, most accepted it as natural, as divinely ordained. The king was the father of his people, and even when life was hard, loyalty to the throne was absolute. But by the late 18th century, the glue that held this ancient pyramid together was beginning to dissolve, and the glittering facade of Versailles could no longer hide the deep cracks forming in its foundations. While the high nobility were trapped in the golden cage of Versailles, playing out their elaborate rituals of status, a quiet but profound revolution was taking place in the minds of their countrymen. This was the Age of Enlightenment, a powerful intellectual and cultural movement that swept across Europe in the 18th century, and its epicenter was undoubtedly Paris. The Enlightenment championed the power of human reason as the primary tool for understanding the universe and improving the human condition. Thinkers known as the philosophes began to apply the principles of scientific inquiry, which had so successfully unlocked the secrets of the physical world, to the far messier worlds of society, government, and religion. They cast a cold, skeptical eye on traditions that had been accepted for centuries, questioning everything from the divine right of kings to the dogmas of the Catholic Church. For them, tradition was not a source of wisdom, but a potential source of error and superstition that needed to be examined, tested, and if found wanting, discarded. One of the sharpest and most famous of these intellectual swordsmen was Voltaire. A brilliant writer, poet, and playwright, he was a master of satire, and he wielded it with devastating effect against the twin pillars of the old order, the monarchy and the church. He famously declared, "I do not agree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it," a powerful encapsulation of his belief in freedom of speech. He relentlessly attacked religious intolerance, superstition, and the immense, often corrupt, power of the established church. His writings were filled with a biting wit that made the powerful squirm and made his readers feel as though they were part of a clever, enlightened club, one that saw the world for what it truly was. He didn't necessarily call for the overthrow of the monarchy, but his constant attacks on its abuses and its claims to divine authority did the work of 1,000 revolutionary pamphlets, slowly eroding the reverence in which the old institutions were held. If Voltaire was the great critic of the old world, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the visionary prophet of a new one. A more sentimental and radical thinker, Rousseau was concerned with the nature of freedom and the sources of inequality. In his seminal work, The Social Contract, he put forth a revolutionary idea. He argued that the only legitimate government was one that had the consent of the governed. He rejected the notion that a king ruled by God's will. Instead, he proposed that true sovereignty, the ultimate right to rule, resided not with the monarch, but with the people themselves. In what he called the general will, the king was not a master, but a servant of the people, and if he failed to serve their interests, they had every right to replace him. This was a political dynamite. It reframed the relationship between the ruler and the ruled, transforming subjects into citizens and turning obedience from a sacred duty into a conditional agreement. His ideas about the noble savage and the corrupting influence of society resonated deeply with those who felt alienated and oppressed by the artificial hierarchies of the ancien regime. Meanwhile, another influential thinker, the Baron de Montesquieu, provided a practical blueprint for how a just and free government might be structured. An aristocrat himself, Montesquieu had studied the political systems of different nations, and he was a great admirer of the English system of constitutional monarchy. In his work, The Spirit of the Laws, he argued that the best way to prevent any government from becoming tyrannical was to divide its powers. He proposed a separation of powers into 3 distinct branches: the executive, the king; the legislative, a parliament; and the judicial, the courts. By setting these different branches in opposition to one another, each acting as a check and balance on the others, the system would prevent any one person or group from accumulating too much power, thereby protecting the liberty of the citizens. This elegant concept would have a profound influence, not just on the French revolutionaries, but on the American founders as well. These were not just abstract theories debated in dusty studies. They were exciting, dangerous, and intoxicating ideas that spread with remarkable speed through French society. They were discussed in the elegant salons of Paris, where aristocratic women would host gatherings of the nation's sharpest minds to debate art, politics, and philosophy over coffee. They were argued over in the hundreds of new coffee houses that were springing up across the city, places where men of the middle class could read the latest newspapers and pamphlets and engage in lively political discourse. And most importantly, they were disseminated through the printed word. The crowning achievement of the French Enlightenment was the Encyclopédie, a massive multi-volume collection of human knowledge edited by Denis Diderot. On the surface, it was a simple encyclopedia with articles on everything from anatomy to zinc mining. But woven throughout its pages was a subtle but persistent critique of the existing order. Its articles on government implicitly favored reason and popular consent over divine right, and its entries on religious topics treated Christian dogma with a detached scientific skepticism. The government and the church rightly saw it as a deeply subversive work and tried to suppress it, but it was too popular. It became a bestseller, spreading the Enlightenment's critical spirit to every corner of the kingdom. The great historical debate is how deeply these ideas penetrated the different layers of society. Did the average peasant in the field really care about Rousseau's concept of the general will? Probably not directly. But these ideas created a new critical vocabulary and a new set of expectations, especially among the educated and ambitious members of the Third Estate. Lawyers, journalists, and local officials began to speak of citizenship, natural rights, and the nation. They started to see the injustices of the tax system and the privileges of the nobility not as an unfortunate but inevitable part of life, but as a violation of a rational and just social order. The Enlightenment didn't cause the French Revolution, but it created the intellectual and cultural framework that made it possible. It gave the revolutionaries a language to articulate their grievances and a vision of a better, more rational, and more just world to replace the one they sought to tear down. The old pyramid, built on faith and tradition, was now being assaulted by the powerful new forces of reason and skepticism. Ideas, no matter how powerful, rarely start a revolution on their own. They need a catalyst, a crisis that exposes the weaknesses of the old system so glaringly that it can no longer be ignored. In the case of France, that catalyst was money, or rather, a catastrophic lack of it. While the philosophes were questioning the theoretical legitimacy of the monarchy, a far more practical and urgent problem was unfolding in the royal treasury. The kingdom was hurtling towards complete and utter bankruptcy. This wasn't a sudden development, but the culmination of a century of reckless spending, costly wars, and a tax system that was, to put it mildly, fundamentally broken. The French monarchy had a spending problem of epic proportions, and the bill was finally coming due. A significant portion of this spending was, of course, the staggering cost of maintaining the royal court and the monarchy's prestige. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a voracious consumer of the national wealth. The endless cycle of balls, banquets, and elaborate court ceremonies, the pensions paid to thousands of favored nobles, and the constant construction and redecoration projects all cost a fortune. And at the center of this world of extravagance was the Queen, Marie Antoinette. The Austrian-born wife of King Louis XVI became, fairly or unfairly, the living symbol of the monarchy's disconnect from the suffering of its people. She was young, beautiful, and utterly tone-deaf to the realities of life outside the palace walls. Stories, often wildly exaggerated by libelous pamphlets, circulated about her lavish lifestyle, her towering powdered hairstyles, her extravagant custom-made gowns, and her charmingly rustic fantasy farm, the Yameau de la Reine, built on the grounds of Versailles, where she and her ladies-in-waiting could play at being simple shepherdesses, complete with perfumed sheep. Her supposed declaration, upon hearing that the peasants had no bread, "Let them eat cake," is almost certainly a myth, but the fact that people believed it speaks volumes about her reputation. The historical debate over her role is complex. She was a foreigner caught in a political snake pit, and much of the criticism was fueled by misogyny and xenophobia. Yet her spending was undeniably lavish and provided an easy, visible target for the public's growing anger. However, the Queen's dress budget, as enormous as it was a mere drop in the bucket compared to the truly ruinous expense: war. For decades, France had been locked in a series of global conflicts, primarily against its great rival, Great Britain. The 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, had been a particularly costly and humiliating defeat for France, resulting in the loss of its colonies in North America and India. Then, in a bid to reclaim its prestige and strike a blow against the British, France made a fateful decision: to intervene on the side of the colonists in the American Revolutionary War. French financial and military support was crucial to the American victory. A French fleet blockaded the British at Yorktown, and French gold paid for American supplies. While it was a sweet geopolitical victory, it was a Pyrrhic one. The cost of the war was astronomical, adding over 1 billion livres to a national debt that was already at a crisis level. The irony was bitter. The absolute monarchy of France had bankrolled a revolution fought in the name of liberty and republican ideals, and in doing so, had signed its own financial death warrant. This mountain of debt might have been manageable if the kingdom had possessed a fair and efficient way of raising money, but it didn't. The French tax system was a chaotic, unjust, and hopelessly outdated mess. As we know, the two wealthiest orders in the kingdom, the clergy and the nobility, were largely exempt from the most important direct tax, the taille. The immense wealth tied up in church lands and aristocratic estates went virtually untouched. This meant that the burden of taxation fell disproportionately on the third estate, and most heavily on the poorest of the poor, the peasantry. The methods of collection were just as infuriating. The government didn't collect taxes directly, but outsourced the job to a private consortium of financiers known as the Farmers General. These tax farmers would pay the state a lump sum for the right to collect taxes in a particular region, and then they would keep anything they collected above that amount. This created a perverse incentive to squeeze the taxpayers as ruthlessly as possible, and the tax collectors were universally despised figures. As the 1780s progressed, the situation became desperate. Over half of the government's entire annual revenue was being spent just to pay the interest on the national debt. The kingdom was essentially running a massive deficit year after year, borrowing new money simply to pay off its old lenders. King Louis XVII, a well-meaning but tragically indecisive and unremarkable man, was ill-equipped to handle such a crisis. He was a devoted husband and father who was more comfortable tinkering with locks or going on hunting trips than he was with the complex and brutal world of state finance. He appointed a series of finance ministers who all came to the same logical but politically explosive conclusion. The only way to solve the crisis was to reform the tax system and force the privileged first and second estates to pay their fair share. Charles Alexandre de Calonne, one such minister, presented a sweeping reform package that included a new land tax that would be paid by all landowners, regardless of their social status. It was a sensible, modern, and absolutely necessary proposal. And the privileged orders met it with furious resistance. They saw it not as a necessary sacrifice for the good of the nation, but as a direct assault on their ancient rights and their very identity. Using their influence in the high courts, called the Parlement, they blocked the king's reforms at every turn, selfishly guarding their privileges, even as the state itself was sinking. The great historical mystery is whether a stronger king could have forced these reforms through. Louis XVI, however, vacillated. Faced with this aristocratic intransigence and a completely empty treasury, he was finally forced to play his last card, a move his ancestors had avoided for 175 years. He agreed to summon the Estates General, the old medieval representative assembly of the three orders, to meet in the spring of 1789 to approve his new taxes. He hoped it would be a way to bypass the stubborn nobles. He had no idea that he was not just opening a meeting. He was opening a Pandora's box. The announcement that the king was calling the Estates General sent a shockwave of excitement and anticipation across France. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the people were being invited to participate, however indirectly, in the great affairs of the nation. It felt like the dawn of a new era, a moment of profound hope. The winter and spring leading up to the meeting in May of 1789 were filled with a flurry of political activity unlike anything the country had ever seen. Elections were held in every corner of the kingdom to choose the deputies who would represent each of the three orders. This process itself was a radicalizing one. For millions of Frenchmen, it was their first taste of politics. In towns and villages, people gathered to debate the issues of the day and to select the men they would entrust with their hopes and grievances. As part of this process, each electoral district was instructed to compile a list of its complaints and suggestions for reform, known as the Cahiers de Doléances, or lists of grievances. These documents provide an extraordinary snapshot of France on the eve of revolution, a collective venting of a century's worth of frustration. Thousands of these lists survive, and they are a historian's treasure. The cahiers from the first and second estates were, as one might expect, primarily concerned with protecting their own privileges. They spoke of the need for fiscal reform, but they were adamant that their ancient rights and tax exemptions should be preserved, framing them as a necessary bulwark against royal tyranny. The cahiers of the Third Estate, however, tell a very different story. They paint a vivid picture of a society groaning under the weight of an unjust system. Peasants wrote of the hated salt tax, the crushing burden of feudal dues, and the injustice of having their crops trampled by a nobleman's hunting party. The bourgeoisie wrote with passion about the need for a written constitution, for legal equality, and for careers in the government and military to be open to men of talent, not just men of noble birth. What is remarkable about these grievances, however, is what they don't say. Reading them, one is struck by the almost universal tone of loyalty and affection for the king. They did not, for the most part, call for a republic or the overthrow of the monarchy. They addressed Louis XVI as a benevolent father who, they believed, had simply been misled by corrupt ministers and selfish aristocrats. They genuinely thought that if they could only make their plight known to him, he would, in his wisdom, set things right. There was a powerful and ultimately naive belief that the king and the Third Estate were natural allies against the entrenched power of the privileged orders. This faith in the monarch as a potential savior was a powerful force, but it would not survive the political battles that were about to begin. The central burning question that dominated all discussion was a seemingly dry, procedural one, but it held the key to the entire future of France. How would the Estates General vote? By tradition, the Assembly voted by order. This meant each of the three estates would debate and vote as a single block. The First Estate would get one vote, the Second Estate would get one vote, and the Third Estate would get one vote. It was a system designed for a medieval world, and its outcome was a foregone conclusion. The clergy and the nobility, the two privileged orders, would naturally vote together to protect their interests, easily outvoting the Third Estate 2-1. Any meaningful reform, particularly tax reform, would be dead on arrival. The deputies of the Third Estate, who were mostly educated lawyers and members of the bourgeoisie, recognized this immediately. They arrived at Versailles armed with a powerful new sense of their own importance. They knew that they represented not just an order, but the overwhelming majority of the nation itself. They began to argue for a different system, voting by head. In this system, each individual deputy would get one vote. In a crucial early concession, the king had agreed that the Third Estate could elect twice as many deputies as the other two orders, roughly 600 for them compared to 300 each for the clergy and nobility. This doubling of the third meant that if they could achieve voting by head, they would have a numerical majority. They could then hope to peel off reform-minded parish priests from the First Estate and a few liberal nobles from the Second, giving them the power to enact a sweeping program of change. The entire revolution, in its early stages, hinged on this single issue. The most forceful and articulate argument for the supremacy of the Third Estate came from a pamphlet written by a clergyman, the Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. His work, titled "What is the Third Estate?" was an electrifying piece of political rhetoric that swept through the country. It began with three simple but devastating questions and answers. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it ask? To become something. Sieyès argued that the Third Estate was not just one order among three, but a complete nation in itself. The nobility, he claimed, was a parasitic cancer, a foreign body that contributed nothing to the nation's life and only drained its resources. The idea of the nation was taking hold, a concept of a unified people bound by common laws and interests, and it was a direct challenge to the old world of corporate privilege. When the deputies finally gathered at Versailles on May 5th, 1789, The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. The opening ceremony itself was a calculated display of the old hierarchies, designed to put the Third Estate in its place. The deputies of the First and Second Estates were instructed to wear magnificent costumes of silk and lace, with feathered hats and swords. The deputies of the Third Estate, by contrast, were ordered to wear plain, somber black suits, the attire of minor legal officials. It was a deliberate public humiliation, and it backfired spectacularly, only serving to unify them and deepen their sense of collective grievance. After the king gave a short, uninspiring speech about the need to fix the nation's finances, and his ministers offered no clear guidance on the crucial issue of voting, the battle lines were drawn. The Third Estate refused to do any business, even the simple task of verifying their credentials, until the other two orders agreed to meet with them as a single body and vote by head. For 6 long, tense weeks, a political stalemate ensued. The Third Estate held firm, engaging in a brilliant strategy of passive resistance. They knew the nation was watching, and they were determined to show that they, and they alone, were the true representatives of the French people. The king dithered, the nobility fumed, and the quiet, stubborn men in black waited. The revolution had begun, not with a riot, but with a procedural dispute. After 6 weeks of paralyzing deadlock, the deputies of the Third Estate decided that the time for waiting was over. The air in Versailles was thick with rumors that the king, urged on by his more conservative noble advisers and his wife, was planning to dissolve the Estates General altogether and rule by decree. The men in black realized that if they didn't act decisively, their historic opportunity would be lost. On June 17th, 1789, emboldened by the impassioned arguments of Abbé Sieyès, they took a momentous and audacious step. They unilaterally declared themselves to be the National Assembly. It was a revolutionary act of profound significance. With this simple declaration, they were no longer just one of 3 orders in a medieval assembly. They were claiming to be the sole legitimate representative body of the entire French nation. They argued that since they represented 97% of the population, they were the nation. The other 2 orders were welcome to join them, not as privileged estates, but as fellow citizens. This was a direct seizure of sovereignty from the king, a clear statement that the ultimate authority to make laws now rested with the elected representatives of the people. The assembly was led by a cast of remarkable figures. Alongside the intellectual architect, Sieyès, there was the imposing and charismatic figure of Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau. Mirabeau was a fascinating and contradictory man. He was a nobleman by birth, but had been elected as a deputy for the Third Estate. A brilliant orator with a scandalous personal life and a face scarred by smallpox, he possessed a booming voice and a magnetic presence that could hold an audience captive. He was a moderate who believed passionately in the need for a constitutional monarchy, a system that would balance the power of the king with the rights of the nation. And his powerful speeches gave voice and courage to the assembly's ambitions. The king and his court were thrown into confusion by this bold move. Louis XVI, caught between a desire for reform and a deep-seated belief in his own absolute authority, was characteristically indecisive. His more hardline advisers, including his younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, urged him to use force to crush this nascent rebellion. They planned a séance royale, a royal session, where the king would appear before all three estates and dictate his will, effectively nullifying the assembly's declarations. In preparation for this royal session, scheduled for June 23rd, the king ordered the main meeting hall of the Third Estate, the Salle des Menus Plaisirs, to be closed and locked, ostensibly for renovations. On the morning of June 20th, a dreary and drizzly day, the deputies of the new National Assembly arrived at their hall to find the doors barred and guarded by royal soldiers. Panic began to set in. They saw this as the first step in a royal coup, the prelude to their arrest and dismissal. They gathered in the street outside, a crowd of anxious black-clad men, their revolutionary project on the verge of collapse before it had even truly begun. But rather than dispersing, their fear quickly turned into a defiant resolve. It was one of their members, a physician named Joseph Ignace Guillotin, whose name would later become ironically attached to a far more gruesome revolutionary invention, who suggested they find an alternative meeting place. He knew of a large cavernous building nearby, an indoor tennis court, the Jeu de Paume, and so the deputies of the Third Estate marched in a solemn procession through the wet streets of Versailles to the tennis court. It was a stark and undecorated space, a world away from the gilded halls of the palace. There was no throne, no grand furniture, just a large empty room with bare walls and a high ceiling. This humble setting only added to the drama and gravity of the moment. Standing in the middle of the court, with deputies crowded around him on benches and tables dragged in from outside, the astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the president of the assembly, climbed onto a makeshift platform. He raised his right hand and read aloud a solemn oath. The deputies swore never to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require, until the constitution of the kingdom is established and consolidated upon firm foundations. One by one, the deputies came forward to sign the oath, their faces a mixture of fear, excitement, and grim determination. A great roar of "Vive l'Assemblée" and "Vive le Roi," for they still saw themselves as acting in the king's true interest, echoed through the hall. Only one deputy refused to sign. The event was immortalized in a famous, dramatic, and somewhat romanticized painting by Jacques-Louis David, which depicts the deputies with their arms outstretched towards Bailly, united in a single, powerful gesture of revolutionary will, with winds of change blowing through the open windows. The historical debate surrounding the oath centers on its spontaneity. Was it a spur-of-the-moment act of defiance, or a carefully calculated piece of political theater? The truth is likely a bit of both. The leaders of the assembly surely knew they needed a powerful unifying gesture to solidify their position. But the raw emotion and genuine fear of that morning were undoubtedly real. The tennis court oath was the revolution's first great act of defiance. It was a clear and public declaration that the representatives of the people would not be intimidated or silenced. When the king finally held his royal session 3 days later and ordered the estates to separate and meet in their old chambers, Mirabeau gave the monarchy its most famous rebuke. When the royal master of ceremonies repeated the king's command to disperse, Mirabeau thundered, "Go, tell those who sent you that we are here by the will of the people, and we will not leave our places except by the force of bayonets." Faced with this unshakable resolve, the king backed down. He eventually gave in and ordered the clergy and the nobility to join the National Assembly. It was a stunning victory for the Third Estate. They had faced down the absolute monarch and won. They had established themselves as the new center of power in France, and their great work of writing a constitution could now begin. But the king and his court had not truly accepted defeat, and outside the rarefied world of Versailles, another more volatile force was about to enter the stage. The people of Paris. The political victories at Versailles were thrilling, but they were taking place in a vacuum. While the deputies of the National Assembly were debating constitutional theory, the city of Paris, just a dozen miles away, was simmering with a much more primal mixture of hunger and fear. The spring and summer of 1789 were a time of acute economic distress. The previous year's harvest had been disastrously poor, leading to a severe shortage of grain. As a result, the price of bread, the staple food that made up more than half of a typical worker's diet, had skyrocketed. The average Parisian laborer was spending as much as 80% of his income just to feed his family, and often there was no bread to be had at any price. This desperation fueled a palpable sense of anger and injustice, a feeling that the people were starving while the aristocrats and the king feasted at Versailles. The baker's shop became a new political stage, a place of rumors, resentment, and a growing conviction that the famine was not an act of God, but a deliberate plot by the nobility to starve the people into submission. This hunger was now compounded by fear. King Louis XVI had publicly accepted the National Assembly, but his actions told a different story. In late June and early July, he began to quietly summon thousands of troops, mostly reliable foreign mercenaries like Swiss and German regiments, to the Paris region. By early July, the capital was surrounded by a ring of some 20,000 soldiers. The official reason was to maintain order, but no one in Paris believed it. They saw the troops for what they were, a threat. The king, it seemed, was preparing to launch his counter-revolution, to use military force to dissolve the assembly and crush the hopes of the Third Estate. The city was a tinderbox, and the air crackled with the nervous energy of an impending storm. Political orators took to the streets, holding impromptu speeches in public squares and gardens, most famously at the Palais Royal, where a fiery young journalist named Camille Desmoulins urged the people to take up arms. The final spark fell on July 11th. King Louis, finally giving in to the hardline faction at court, dismissed and exiled his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker. Necker was a Swiss Protestant, and while his actual abilities as a financier were debatable, he was seen by the public as their man in the government, the one minister who was genuinely trying to solve the crisis and who was sympathetic to the cause of the Third Estate. His dismissal was interpreted as a declaration of war, a clear sign that the royalist coup was about to begin. When news of Necker's firing reached Paris on July 12th, the city erupted. Crowds poured into the streets, carrying wax busts of Necker salvaged from a local museum. They clashed with royal cavalry units, and the city descended into a state of near anarchy. Over the next 2 days, the people of Paris began to arm themselves. They raided gunsmith shops and sword cutlers' workshops. In a crucial move, they stormed the military hospital at the Hôtel des Invalides, seizing tens of thousands of muskets. They now had guns, but they lacked the one crucial element to make them work: gunpowder, and they knew exactly where to find it. Looming over the eastern part of the city was the Bastille, a massive, grim stone fortress with 8 imposing towers. The Bastille had been built in the Middle Ages to defend the city, but by the 18th century, it had become a notorious state prison. In reality, its importance was mostly symbolic. It was an expensive and outdated fortress that the government was already considering demolishing, and by 1789, it held only 7 prisoners, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 wayward aristocrat. But in the public imagination, the Bastille was the ultimate symbol of royal tyranny and arbitrary power. It was the place where the king could imprison his enemies indefinitely without trial, based on a simple secret order known as a lettre de cachet. To the people of Paris, it represented everything they hated about the Ancien Regime. And most importantly, on this day, its cellars held a massive store of gunpowder. On the morning of July 14th, a huge crowd, a volatile mix of shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers from the working-class Faubourg Saint-Antoine district, gathered outside the fortress, demanding that its governor, the Marquis de Launay, surrender the gunpowder and remove the cannons that were pointed menacingly at the city streets. De Launay refused. Negotiations dragged on for hours. The mood grew uglier, more impatient. Sometime in the early afternoon, a few men managed to climb the walls and lower one of the drawbridges. The crowd surged into the outer courtyard, and the garrison of Swiss guards and elderly French veterans opened fire. The battle for the Bastille had begun. For 4 hours, a chaotic and bloody siege raged. The crowd, armed with the muskets from the Invalides, fired from the rooftops of surrounding buildings, while the fortress's defenders answered with cannon and musket fire from the towers. The attackers were disorganized but relentless. The crucial turning point came when a contingent of mutinous royal soldiers, the Garde Françaises, joined the crowd, bringing with them professional military experience and, most critically, several cannons. They aimed their artillery directly at the main gate. The governor, de Launay, seeing that his position was hopeless, finally surrendered. The crowd poured into the fortress, liberating the handful of bewildered prisoners and seizing the gunpowder. The governor was taken prisoner and marched towards City Hall, but on the way, he was overwhelmed by the vengeful mob, murdered, and his head was sawn off with a pocket knife, stuck on a pike, and paraded triumphantly through the streets. The fall of the Bastille was a stunning victory. It was a military triumph, but more than that, it was a symbolic earthquake. The people of Paris had, through their own courage and violence, defeated a symbol of royal power that had stood for centuries. When the king, returning from a hunting trip, was told of the day's events, he asked his advisor, "Is it a revolt?" The famous reply came, "No, sire, it is not a revolt, it is a revolution." The violence had saved the National Assembly, as the king, shocked by the events, withdrew his troops from Paris and reinstated Necker. The revolution was no longer just a legal debate among educated men in Versailles. It was now a popular movement, baptized in blood, and its center of gravity had shifted decisively to the streets of Paris. The fall of the Bastille was a Parisian drama, but news of it spread across France like a wildfire, carried by breathless couriers and reprinted in hastily produced pamphlets. In the villages and towns of the provinces, the king's authority, already weakened, now seemed to completely evaporate. Local officials were overthrown, and new municipal councils and citizen militias, styled after the new National Guard in Paris, were formed. But in the vast French countryside, where the majority of the population lived, the news from the capital mixed with long-standing grievances, and a potent cocktail of rumors to create a strange and terrifying phenomenon that would become known as the Great Fear, or La Grande Peur. For several weeks in late July and early August of 1789, a wave of collective hysteria and peasant violence swept across large swathes of the nation. The roots of the Great Fear lay in the same economic desperation that had gripped Paris. The peasants were hungry, suffering from the same bread shortages, and they were deeply suspicious of the nobility, whom they blamed for their plight. A powerful conspiracy theory took hold and spread with astonishing speed. The aristocrats, furious at the Third Estate's victory at Versailles, were supposedly taking their revenge by hiring armies of brigands and vagrants to roam the countryside, burning crops and ripening harvests in the fields to starve the people into submission. There was no evidence for this aristocratic plot. But in the tense and uncertain atmosphere of that summer, it seemed entirely plausible. Every dust cloud on the horizon, every unfamiliar face in the village, every strange light at night was interpreted as proof that the brigands were coming. The fear was infectious, and it triggered a massive defensive mobilization. Peasants armed themselves with whatever they could find: pitchforks, hunting rifles, farming scythes, and stood guard in their villages, waiting for an enemy who never arrived. This defensive panic soon turned into an offensive uprising. The peasants, already armed and organized, realized that the real source of their misery was not some phantom army of brigands, but the very real system of feudalism that had oppressed their families for centuries. If the aristocrats were plotting against them, they reasoned, then it was time to strike back at the symbols of aristocratic power. All across the country, bands of peasants descended upon the local chateau, the grand manor houses of the nobility of the time. Their primary goal was not necessarily to harm the lord himself, many of whom had already fled, but to destroy the legal basis of his power. They stormed the archives and cellars of the castles, seeking out the ancient feudal charters, the dusty parchments that recorded all the obligations and dues the peasants owed to their masters. These documents, which listed everything from the annual payments of grain to the hated requirement to work on the lord's land, were the legal chains of their servitude. In great bonfires in the castle courtyards, the peasants burned these records, an act of liberation that was both practical and profoundly symbolic. The violence was sporadic. In some cases, the lords and their families were treated with a degree of respect. In others, chateaux were looted and burned to the ground, and particularly hated nobles or their agents were sometimes attacked and killed. But the main thrust of the movement was the wholesale dismantling of the feudal system from the ground up. The peasants refused to pay their dues. They reclaimed common lands that had been enclosed by the aristocracy, and they hunted freely in the forests that had once been the exclusive preserve of the nobility. This was a revolution that was far more radical and socially profound than the legalistic debates taking place in the National Assembly. It was a direct, violent, and largely successful peasant war against the remnants of medieval France. News of this chaos in the countryside soon reached the deputies at Versailles, and it filled them with alarm. The members of the Assembly, who were mostly bourgeois property owners, were staunch defenders of law and order. They were terrified by the prospect of this popular anarchy, and knew they had to do something to pacify the peasantry and restore control. On the night of August 4th, They convened a special session to discuss the crisis. What followed was one of the most remarkable and dramatic sessions in the history of the Revolution. A liberal nobleman, the Vicomte de Noailles, took the floor and made a startling proposal. He argued that the only way to calm the provinces was for the nobility to voluntarily renounce its feudal privileges. What began as a pragmatic political maneuver quickly escalated into a patriotic frenzy of self-sacrifice. One after another, the greatest nobles of the realm, the dukes and marquises, whose families had held their privileges for centuries, stood up and in emotional speeches renounced their ancient rights. The Duc d'Aiguillon, one of the wealthiest landowners in France, declared his support for legal and tax equality. The clergy followed suit, giving up their right to collect the tithe. Soon, representatives from provinces and towns were surrendering their own special historic privileges, all in the name of creating a unified French nation. In a single, feverish, all-night session, fueled by a strange mixture of fear, idealism, and patriotic fervor, the Assembly systematically dismantled the entire legal and social framework of the Ancien regime. They abolished feudal dues, the right of the lord to hunt, the sale of public offices, and tax exemptions. By the time the sun rose on the morning of August 5th, the old order of corporate privilege was dead. The Assembly later codified these resolutions in a series of decrees, famously declaring, "The National Assembly hereby completely destroys the feudal system." The great fear in the countryside had forced the hand of the politicians in Versailles, accelerating the pace of the revolution and transforming a struggle over a constitution into a profound social transformation. Having swept away the rubble of the old feudal world in that single feverish night of August 4th, the National Assembly now faced a more profound and complex task: to lay the philosophical cornerstone for the new France they intended to build. Before they could write a detailed constitution, they needed to agree upon a set of fundamental principles, a statement of intent that would define the very meaning of their revolution. The result was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a short, elegant, and monumentally important document that would become one of the most influential political texts in human history. Issued in late August 1789, it was the revolution's birth certificate, a lyrical and powerful articulation of the Enlightenment ideals that had been bubbling under the surface of French society for decades. The creation of the Declaration was a deeply intellectual process, a series of intense debates among the deputies about the very nature of liberty, law, and government. The Assembly was filled with men who were steeped in the writings of the philosophes, the ideas of Montesquieu, the skepticism of Voltaire, and above all, the powerful concepts of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau echoed through every clause. The influence of the recent American Revolution was also immense. Thomas Jefferson was serving as the American ambassador to France at the time, and his Paris residence became an informal salon for many of the key figures in the Assembly. One of the leading proponents of the Declaration, the Marquis de Lafayette, a hero of the American War and a close friend of Jefferson, had even circulated his own draft, which he had shown to his American mentor for advice. The French Declaration was thus a product of this transatlantic conversation, a distillation of the most advanced political thinking of its time. The document opens with a majestic and soaring preamble stating that the ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole cause of public calamities and of the corruption of governments. To prevent this, it seeks to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, unalienable, and sacred rights of man. This very first sentence was a revolution in itself. It located the source of political legitimacy not in the will of God or the traditions of a dynasty, but in the inherent rights of individual human beings. The 17 articles that follow build upon this foundation, creating a blueprint for a new kind of society. The first and most famous article declares, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights." This single sentence was a dagger to the heart of the ancien regime, with its intricate pyramid of legal privileges and hereditary status. It was a formal rejection of the idea that a person's worth or opportunities should be determined by the accident of their birth. The Declaration goes on to define these natural rights as liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It was a clear statement that the primary purpose of any government was not to aggrandize a king or enforce religious dogma, but to protect the lives and freedoms of its individual citizens. Many of the articles dealt with the nature of law and justice. The Declaration asserts that all citizens are equal before the law, that no one can be arrested or punished except according to established legal procedures, and that every person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. This was a direct assault on the arbitrary justice of the old monarchy, with its secret lettres de cachet and its brutal methods of interrogation. It enshrined the principle of popular sovereignty, stating explicitly in Article 3 that the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. The law, it continues, is to be an expression of the general will, and all citizens have the right to participate in its formation, either personally or through their representatives. The king was no longer the source of law, the nation was. The Declaration also championed the great Enlightenment freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. It called for a fair system of taxation to be paid by all citizens in proportion to their means, a direct response to the unjust tax system that had brought the monarchy to its knees. And finally, it established the principle of public accountability, stating that society has the right to require every public agent to account for their administration. It was, in essence, a complete theoretical demolition of the principles of absolute monarchy and a blueprint for a liberal constitutional state. Yet for all its universalist language, the Declaration was a document of its time, and it contained significant and troubling limitations. The most glaring of these was its understanding of man and citizen. The deputies who wrote these words, for all their radicalism, were men of the 18th century, and they implicitly understood man to mean property-owning, white, adult males. The question of slavery in the French colonies was deliberately avoided. The rights of religious minorities like Protestants and Jews were debated and only granted later, and with some reluctance. And most significantly, the rights of women were completely ignored. This omission did not go unchallenged. In 1791, a brilliant and courageous playwright and political activist named Olympe de Gouges published a direct response, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. In it, she cleverly rewrote the original declaration, article for article, to include women. Her version began with the electrifying statement, "Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights." She argued that if women had the right to be executed by the guillotine, they should also have the right to speak in public and participate in government. Her declaration was a pioneering work of feminist thought, but it was largely dismissed at the time. De Gourge herself would later be executed during the Reign of Terror, a tragic victim of the revolution's failure to live up to its own highest ideals. This historical debate over the Declaration's universality continues to this day. Was it a tragically flawed document, a product of the prejudices of its time? Or was its true power in the universal principles it unleashed, which could then be used by marginalized groups, from women to colonial subjects, to demand the very rights its authors had initially denied them? Whatever its limitations, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was a watershed moment. It transformed the French Revolution from a mere fiscal crisis into a universal struggle for human liberty, and its words would echo in every subsequent fight for freedom around the globe. The Declaration of Rights was a beautiful and inspiring statement of principle, but its lofty words could not fill an empty stomach. As the autumn of 1789 began, the city of Paris was once again in the grips of a severe bread shortage. The harvest had been gathered, but the grain was not making it to the capital in sufficient quantities. The long queues outside bakeries formed again, and the mood in the working-class districts grew dark and angry. Political suspicion was also running high. The king had still not formally approved the August decrees that abolished feudalism, nor had he given his royal assent to the Declaration of Rights. To the people of Paris, his hesitation looked like stubborn defiance, a sign that he was still listening to the hardline aristocrats at court who were plotting a counter-revolution. Rumors began to circulate that the king was planning to flee, perhaps to the royalist stronghold of Metz in the east, where he could rally loyal troops and march back to crush the National Assembly. This fear was dramatically inflamed by reports of a banquet held at the Palace of Versailles on October 1st. At this feast for the officers of the newly arrived Flanders Regiment, the king's personal bodyguards, the mood had apparently grown defiantly royalist. In a drunken fervor, the officers had supposedly thrown the new revolutionary tricolor cockade, the red, white, and blue emblem of the new France, to the ground and trampled on it, replacing it with the white cockade of the Bourbon monarchy and the black cockade of the Queen. When news of this desecration of the revolutionary symbol reached Paris, it was seen as an intolerable insult, the final proof of the court's treachery. The radical press seized on the story, painting a picture of a decadent court feasting and plotting against the nation while the common people starved. The breaking point came on the morning of October 5th. It was a cold, rainy Monday. The women of the central markets of Paris, the formidable poissards or fishwives, known for their sharp tongues and physical toughness, had finally had enough. They began to gather in the marketplace, their anger over the price of bread boiling over into a full-scale protest. One young woman reportedly seized a drum and began marching through the streets, her drumming acting as a rallying cry. Soon thousands of women had joined her, armed with kitchen knives, rolling pins, and even a few old cannons dragged from the city hall. Their initial demand was simple: bread. but it quickly merged with the political outrage over the events at Versailles. They began to shout for the king to come to Paris, believing that if he were in the city, among his people, he could not be so easily manipulated by the Austrian, their name for the queen and the corrupt court. The crowd, which now numbered in the thousands, first stormed the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, demanding bread and weapons. They then made an extraordinary decision. They would march to Versailles themselves, a 12-mile trek through the mud and rain, to bring their grievances directly to the king and the National Assembly. As they began their long, arduous journey, they were joined by thousands of others, including men and members of the National Guard, who were swept up in the momentum of the moment. The Marquis de Lafayette, the commander of the National Guard, was initially reluctant to follow, but he was eventually forced by his own men to lead a more organized contingent of guardsmen to Versailles, ostensibly to keep order, but also to ensure the marchers' demands were heard. The scene at Versailles that afternoon was one of utter chaos. The massive, mud-splattered crowd of angry Parisian women arrived at the gates of the palace, their shouts for bread echoing through the grand courtyards. A delegation of the women was allowed into the hall of the National Assembly, where they barged onto the floor, surrounding the terrified deputies and demanding that they take action to lower the price of bread. The assembly, overwhelmed, quickly promised to do what it could and sent a deputation, led by their president and including some of the market women, to see the king. Louis XVI, who had been out hunting when the march began, met with the women and, with his customary gentleness, promised to order all the grain in Versailles to be sent to Paris. This seemed to satisfy some of the marchers, but the majority were not so easily appeased. Their core demand remained. The king must return with them to Paris. That night, an uneasy and tense standoff ensued. Lafayette and his National Guardsmen finally arrived and took up positions to protect the palace, but the huge crowd remained in the courtyards, their mood still volatile. The tragic climax came in the pre-dawn hours of October 6th. A small group of protesters, searching for another way into the palace, found an unlocked gate and surged inside. They rushed through the corridors, their primary target being the Queen's apartments, screaming for her death. Marie Antoinette, awakened just in time by her ladies-in-waiting, was forced to flee in terror through a secret passage to the king's chambers, just moments before the mob broke into her bedroom and hacked her bed to pieces with their pikes. The palace guards were overwhelmed. Several were killed, and their heads were cut off and paraded on pikes. To quell the violence, the king, on Lafayette's advice, agreed to appear on a balcony before the massive, menacing crowd. He was met with shouts of "Vive le roi!" but the cries soon changed to Paris, to Paris." In a moment of extraordinary personal courage, Marie Antoinette, the focus of so much of the crowd's hatred, then stepped out onto the balcony herself, flanked by her young children. The crowd momentarily fell silent, some raising their muskets, before Lafayette knelt and kissed her hand, a gesture of respect that seemed to diffuse the immediate threat. But the will of the crowd was unshakable. The king had no choice but to submit. Later that day, a bizarre and unprecedented procession set out from Versailles. At its head were the National Guardsmen, carrying pikes topped with the heads of the slain palace guards, and wagons loaded with flour from the palace stores. Then came the royal carriage, carrying the king, the queen, and their son, followed by the deputies of the National Assembly. They were surrounded by the vast jubilant crowd of Parisian women who were chanting that they were bringing the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy back to Paris. The Women's March had succeeded. The king's power was broken. He was now, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner of his own people, his authority subject to the will of the Paris crowd. The move to the Tuileries Palace, in the heart of the capital, marked the definitive end of the old courtly world of Versailles and the beginning of a new, more radical, and far more dangerous phase of the revolution. With the king and the assembly now installed in Paris, under the watchful and often intimidating gaze of the city's populace, the revolution entered a new, more constructive, and seemingly more stable phase. For the next 2 years, from late 1789 to 1791, the National Assembly worked tirelessly to fulfill the promise of the tennis court oath, to give France a written constitution. This was the intellectual high point of the revolution's moderate bourgeois leadership. Their goal was not to create a republic or to unleash social anarchy, but to build a rational, orderly, and modern state, a constitutional monarchy that would balance the ancient authority of the king with the newfound sovereignty of the nation. They were men of the Enlightenment, and they set about redesigning France from the ground up with the geometric precision of an architect drawing a blueprint. Their first major task was to rationalize the chaotic and overlapping jurisdictions of the Ancien Regime. They swept away the old historic provinces, Burgundy, Normandy, Provence, with their unique laws, customs, and tax structures. In their place, they divided the entire country into 83 new administrative units, called départements. These were roughly equal in size and were often named after natural features like rivers and mountains, a deliberate attempt to erase the old feudal loyalties and create a single, unified nation. They reformed the legal system, abolishing the hated parliaments and creating a new, more uniform system of courts with elected judges. It was a monumental work of administrative centralization, creating the framework for the modern French state. The Assembly also tackled the problem that had started the revolution in the first place: the state's catastrophic finances. To solve the debt crisis and to fund the new government, they made a bold and highly controversial move. In late 1789, they voted to nationalize all the property of the Catholic Church. The vast landholdings of the clergy, which, remember, made up over 10% of all the land in France, were seized by the state. This immense wealth was then used as collateral to back a new form of paper money, the assignats. The idea at first was that people could buy these bonds, which they could then use to purchase the confiscated church lands. But the assignats soon began to circulate as a regular currency. This policy had a dual purpose. It solved the government's immediate financial problems, and it also created a new class of property owners, mostly wealthy peasants and bourgeois, who now had a vested financial interest in the success of the revolution. If the monarchy were ever to be restored, they might lose their new lands, a powerful incentive to oppose any counter-revolution. To further rationalize the economy, the Assembly abolished all internal customs barriers, creating a single national market, and dismantled the old medieval guilds, promoting free enterprise. However, in a move that revealed their pro-business, anti-labor bias, they also passed the Le Chapelier Law in 1791, which banned all workers' associations and trade unions, a blow to the aspirations of the urban working class. The centerpiece of their efforts was, of course, the Constitution of 1791. After 2 years of debate, it finally established a limited constitutional monarchy. The old system of 3 estates was formally abolished. The new government was to be dominated by a single legislative body, the Legislative Assembly, which would be responsible for making all the laws. The king, now officially titled the King of the French, rather than the King of France, to signify that his power came from the people, was granted a limited, suspensive veto. He could delay the passage of a law, but he could not block it permanently if the assembly passed it multiple times. It was a system that placed the real power squarely in the hands of the elected representatives. However, the right to vote and to hold office was not universal. The assembly, fearful of the mob, distinguished between active and passive citizens. Only men over 25, who paid a certain amount in taxes, the active citizens, were given the right to vote. This meant that while all citizens had equal civil rights, only the propertied classes, about half the adult male population, were granted full political rights. But the Assembly's most fateful and divisive reform was its complete overhaul of the Catholic Church. In the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, passed in 1790, they sought to make the Church a department of the state, completely subordinate to the new government. Under this law, bishops and priests were no longer to be appointed by the Pope, but were to be elected by the citizens of their districts, including non-Catholics. The number of dioceses was reduced to align with the new departments, and all clergy were to be paid a salary by the state. To cap it all off, every priest and bishop was required to swear a public oath of allegiance to the new constitution. This was a colossal miscalculation. The assembly had blundered into a deeply spiritual and emotional domain without understanding the consequences. For thousands of priests and millions of devout French Catholics, this was an intolerable intrusion of the state into the sacred affairs of the Church. Their ultimate allegiance was to God and the Pope in Rome, not to the politicians in Paris. Pope Pius VI eventually condemned the civil constitution, and the French clergy was split in two. About half of the priests, known as the juring clergy, took the oath, either out of conviction or pragmatism. The other half, the non-juring or refractory priests, refused. These refractory priests were now seen by the state as enemies of the revolution, and they began to lead a powerful, grassroots counter-revolutionary movement, especially in the devoutly Catholic regions of Western France. The civil constitution of the clergy shattered the near-universal support the revolution had enjoyed in its early days. It created a deep and lasting schism in French society, transforming a political disagreement into a bitter moral and religious crusade. The Assembly's attempt to build a rational secular state had inadvertently given the forces of counter-revolution their most powerful and popular cause. King Louis XVI was a man of devout faith, and the civil constitution of the clergy was a wound to his conscience. He had been raised to believe he was the most Christian king of France, the divinely appointed protector of the Catholic faith. Now, the Assembly was asking him to approve a law that had been condemned by the Pope, and which he believed put the souls of his subjects in mortal peril. He felt trapped. For months, he had been living in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, a gilded cage where his every move was watched by the National Guard and the suspicious eyes of the Parisian public. He was no longer the master of his kingdom, but a reluctant rubber stamp for a revolution that was spiraling away from the moderate reforms he had been willing to accept. The dream of a collaborative constitutional monarchy, one based on mutual trust between the king and the nation, was dying, and in its place, a sense of profound betrayal was growing on both sides. Urged on by the Queen, Marie Antoinette, who had always been more clear-eyed and contemptuous of the revolution than her hesitant husband, and by his advisers in exile, Louis made a fateful decision. He would flee. The plan was not to abandon France altogether, but to escape from the radical cauldron of Paris and travel to the eastern frontier, to the town of Montmédy. There, he could rally loyal army units under the command of the royalist General de Bouillé. From this position of strength, he believed he could renegotiate the terms of the Constitution, roll back the Assembly's most radical excesses, particularly its religious policies, and restore a measure of his lost authority. It was a desperate gamble, a plan that required meticulous secrecy and flawless execution. It would have neither. The escape was planned for the night of June 20th, 1791. The royal family, the king, the queen, their 2 children, and the king's sister were to slip out of the Tuileries palace in disguise. The king was dressed as a valet. The young Dauphin, the heir to the throne, was dressed as a girl, and the queen was disguised as a Russian governess. Their escape from the heavily guarded palace was itself a small miracle, a tense, near-farcical series of close calls and missed connections in the darkened courtyards. They finally managed to board a large, conspicuous, and slow-moving custom-built carriage, a berlin, which was waiting for them on the outskirts of Paris. From the very beginning, the plan was plagued by a series of small but crucial errors. The departure was delayed by several hours, which meant that the carefully timed relays of loyal soldiers who were supposed to meet them along the road would be in the wrong place at the wrong time, as the heavy berlin rumbled eastward through the night and into the following day. The king, who had been cooped up for so long, seemed to relax. He was confident, even cheerful, convinced he had outsmarted his jailers. But his famous face was a liability. Though he was dressed as a servant, he was not accustomed to playing the part, and repeatedly poked his head out the window to look at the passing countryside. The whole enterprise had a fatal air of aristocratic amateurism. At the town of Saint-Ménéhould, their luck finally ran out. The local postmaster, a staunchly patriotic man named Jean-Baptiste Drouet, was supervising the change of horses for the berlin. He was not an avid reader of revolutionary pamphlets for nothing. He thought he recognized the Queen, and then he caught a glimpse of the valet's face. It seemed familiar. He remembered seeing it somewhere before. He rushed inside, pulled out a new 50-livre assignat banknote, and compared the portrait printed on it with the face of the man in the carriage. It was a perfect match. It was the king. Drouet's mind raced. He knew he couldn't stop the carriage himself, but he also knew its next scheduled stop was the small town of Varennes-en-Argonne. In a heroic feat of patriotism, he and a friend leapt onto their horses and galloped off on a shortcut through the dark woods, determined to beat the royal carriage to Varennes and raise the alarm. They arrived just in the nick of time. The exhausted royal family had reached Varennes to find that their military escort, confused by the delay, was nowhere to be found. As their drivers searched for the fresh relay of horses in the darkened streets, Drouet and his allies quickly roused the local officials and blocked the bridge out of town with a cart full of furniture. The royal carriage was trapped. The king was confronted by the local prosecutor, a grocer named Sauce. At first, Louis denied his identity, but the evidence was overwhelming. Defeated, he finally admitted, "Yes, I am your king." The flight to Varennes, as it came to be known, was a political and psychological disaster for the monarchy. The royal family was forced to make the long, humiliating journey back to Paris, surrounded not by loyal subjects, but by an enormous crowd of angry and silent citizens. The National Assembly had ordered that no one should cheer or insult the king, but simply observe his capture in stony silence, a clear sign that he was no longer seen as a beloved father, but as a traitor. The historical significance of this event cannot be overstated. It shattered whatever trust remained between the king and the people. The image of the monarch as a benevolent father figure was destroyed, replaced by the image of a weak, duplicitous man who had attempted to abandon his nation in its hour of need. His flight was seen as a clear repudiation of the revolution and the constitution he had sworn to uphold. For the moderate constitutional monarchists like Lafayette, the situation was a nightmare. Their entire political project was built on the fiction that the king was a willing partner in the revolution. To save their constitution, they were forced to promote the absurd lie that the king had not fled, but had been abducted by evil aristocrats. No one believed it. For the growing number of radicals and Republicans in Paris, Varennes was a gift. It was the final, irrefutable proof that the monarchy was incompatible with the revolution. The idea of a French republic, once a fringe and extreme notion, now entered the mainstream of political debate. The king had tried to escape his revolution, but he had only succeeded in accelerating its course towards a far more radical and violent destination. The king's failed flight to Varennes sent ripples of alarm not just through France, but across the royal courts of Europe. The monarchs of Austria, Prussia, and Russia had watched the events in France with a mixture of morbid fascination and growing anxiety. The French Revolution was no longer just a domestic squabble. It was a contagious disease of ideas that threatened to infect the entire continent. The thought of popular sovereignty, of citizens putting their king on trial, was a terrifying prospect to rulers whose power rested on the unquestioned principles of divine right and hereditary succession. Marie Antoinette's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II of Austria, was now under immense pressure from aristocratic French émigrés to intervene and restore the authority of the French crown. In August 1791, the rulers of Austria and Prussia met and issued a joint statement known as the Declaration of Pillnitz. On the surface, it was a piece of diplomatic blustering. The two monarchs declared that the situation of the French king was a matter of common interest to all the sovereigns of Europe and threatened vague, unspecified military action if the royal family was harmed. They made any intervention conditional on the cooperation of all the other major European powers, which they knew was highly unlikely to happen. The declaration was a carefully worded attempt to sound menacing without actually committing to anything. A classic case of diplomatic saber-rattling designed to appease the émigrés. But in the hyper-paranoid atmosphere of revolutionary France, this nuanced threat was not received with cynical calm. It was interpreted as a direct and imminent declaration of war, a clear sign that the crowned heads of Europe were forming a great crusade to crush the revolution. The declaration, intended to intimidate, instead had the opposite effect. It inflamed French nationalism and bolstered the arguments of those who believed that France's survival depended on striking the first blow. In October 1791, the National Assembly, its work complete, was dissolved and replaced by a new body elected under the rules of the new constitution, the Legislative Assembly. This new assembly was composed of entirely new men, as a self-denying ordinance proposed by a deputy named Maximilien Robespierre had prevented members of the old National Assembly from serving in the new one. The Legislative Assembly was younger, less experienced, and generally more radical than its predecessor. It soon fractured into competing political factions. On the right sat the constitutional monarchists, who sought to preserve the settlement of 1791. On the left sat a large and vocal group of deputies, who were deeply suspicious of the king and increasingly drawn to republican ideas. The most articulate and influential of these leftist factions came to be known as the Girondins, named after the Gironde region, where many of their leaders came from. They were also known as the Brissotins, after their eloquent and ambitious leader, Jacques-Pierre Brissot. Brissot and the Girondins began to passionately champion the cause of war. They believed that a foreign war would be the ultimate test of the revolution's strength and the king's loyalty. They argued that a conflict with the tyrants of Europe would force Louis XVI to either fully embrace the revolution or expose himself as a traitor. They were convinced it would unite the nation in a great patriotic crusade, flushing out counter-revolutionaries at home and allowing France to export the glorious principles of liberty to the oppressed peoples of Europe. "This is a crusade for universal liberty," Brissot declared in a famous speech. It was an intoxicating and deeply idealistic vision, a revolutionary war that would liberate humanity, beginning with the overthrow of the Habsburgs in Austria. What is so strange and tragic about this drive to war is that it was supported by almost every political faction, each for their own contradictory reasons. The Girondins wanted war to radicalize the revolution and expose the king. The king and his royalist supporters also secretly wanted war, but for the opposite reason. They believed, with a great deal of justification, that the disorganized and undisciplined new French army would be quickly and humiliatingly defeated by the professional armies of Austria and Prussia. In the ensuing chaos, the people would turn back to their monarch as the only source of stability, and the foreign powers would help him to restore his absolute authority. It was a cynical and deeply unpatriotic gamble. The only group that seemed to want peace was a small, isolated faction of radicals on the far left, whose most powerful voice belonged to the quiet, calculating Maximilien Robespierre. At the Jacobin Club, the influential political club that served as a meeting ground for the most radical revolutionaries, Robespierre stood almost alone in arguing against the war. In a series of brilliant and prophetic speeches, he warned that war would play directly into the hands of the king and the court. He argued that the real enemies were not the distant armies in Austria, but the counter-revolutionaries at home. The most extravagant idea that can be born in the head of a politician, he warned, is to believe that it is enough for a people to enter another's territory with arms in hand to make them adopt its laws and its constitution. No one loves armed missionaries. He predicted that a war would inevitably lead to military dictatorship as a victorious general, would be tempted to seize power for himself. His warnings were dismissed as the timid ramblings of a man who lacked revolutionary fervor. The patriotic war fever, fanned by the fiery rhetoric of the Girondins, was simply too strong to resist. By the spring of 1792, the calls for war had become deafening. The Girondin-led government issued a series of ultimatums to the Austrian emperor, demanding that he disperse the émigré armies gathering on the border. When these demands were refused, the path was clear. On April 20th, 1792, King Louis XVI, in a strange and surreal spectacle, appeared before the Legislative Assembly, and with a trembling voice proposed a declaration of war against his own brother-in-law, the King of Hungary and Bohemia, the Austrian Emperor. The Assembly, swept up in a wave of patriotic delirium, voted almost unanimously in favor. France was now at war. The conflict, which they naively believed would be a short and glorious crusade, would in fact last for nearly a quarter of a century, engulfing all of Europe. It would consume the constitutional monarchy, give birth to the Reign of Terror, and ultimately pave the way for the rise of the very military dictator Robespierre had so clearly foreseen. The war began as a complete and unmitigated disaster, just as the king had hoped and Robespierre had feared. The new French army was a disorganized, undisciplined mess. The officer corps, which had been almost entirely aristocratic, had been decimated by emigration. The volunteer soldiers were enthusiastic, but poorly trained and equipped. When the French forces advanced into the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, they were met with stiff resistance and immediately fell apart. At the first sign of real combat, entire units broke and fled, in one instance even murdering their own general, whom they accused of treason. The professional armies of Austria and Prussia, under the command of the Duke of Brunswick, began a slow, methodical, and seemingly unstoppable advance into France. It appeared as though the royalists' cynical gamble was about to pay off. Paris itself now lay vulnerable. This string of humiliating defeats sent a wave of panic and fury through the capital. The Girondins, who had championed the war, were now on the defensive, and they deflected blame by ratcheting up their rhetoric against the king. They accused him of treason, claiming that he and his Austrian committee at court were secretly passing French military plans to the enemy. This suspicion was solidified in late July 1792, when the Duke of Brunswick issued a proclamation to the people of Paris. The Brunswick Manifesto, as it became known, was intended to terrify the city into submission. It warned that if the French royal family were harmed in any way, the Allied armies would inflict an exemplary and forever memorable vengeance by giving up the city of Paris to military execution and total destruction. It was one of the most catastrophic own goals in military history. The manifesto, rather than cowing the Parisians, enraged them. It was the final, irrefutable proof that the king was in league with the foreign invaders. To threaten Paris was to threaten the revolution itself. And the people responded not with fear, but with a defiant surge of patriotic rage. The radical sections of Paris, dominated by the artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers who came to be known as the sans-culottes, literally without knee breeches, a reference to their long trousers as opposed to the silk knee breeches of the aristocracy, began to demand the king's deposition. On the night of August 9th, they took matters into their own hands. A new radical city government, the Paris Commune, was formed. In the early hours of August 10th, 1792, a massive crowd of sans-culottes, joined by radical National Guard units from the provinces, marched on the Tuileries Palace. This was not a spontaneous uprising like the storming of the Bastille. It was an organized military assault. The palace was defended by its loyal contingent of some 900 Swiss guards. The king, seeing the massive, heavily armed crowd approaching, made a decision to flee with his family across the gardens to the nearby Legislative Assembly, where he hoped the deputies would protect him. His departure left the Swiss guards in an impossible position. In the confusion, fighting broke out. The Swiss, renowned for their discipline and courage, initially drove the attackers back. But the revolutionaries, enraged by the initial losses, regrouped and brought in cannons. What followed was a brutal and merciless battle. The palace was stormed, and the Swiss guards, hopelessly outnumbered, were overwhelmed and slaughtered. Many were killed in the fighting. Others who surrendered were massacred by the vengeful mob. The palace was ransacked, its luxurious contents destroyed in a symbolic rejection of royal decadence. The storming of the Tuileries was the bloody and violent end of the French monarchy. The Legislative Assembly, intimidated by the victorious Commune, had no choice but to formally suspend the king, place him and his family under arrest, and call for the election of a new assembly, a national convention, to be elected by universal male suffrage to decide the future of France. In the wake of this second revolution, a dangerous power vacuum emerged, with the central government in disarray and the Prussian army continuing its advance. Fear and paranoia reached a fever pitch. The radical journalist Jean-Paul Marat, in his popular paper L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, called for the people to kill the traitors in their midst before they could break out of the prisons and join the advancing enemy. In the first week of September, this paranoia exploded into an orgy of violence. For several days, armed mobs of sans-culottes broke into the prisons of Paris and began summarily executing the inmates. They set up makeshift revolutionary tribunals, holding sham trials before slaughtering the prisoners in the courtyards. The initial targets were political prisoners and non-juring priests, but the violence soon spread to include thousands of common criminals, prostitutes, and petty debtors. The September massacres were a horrific episode of popular justice at its most brutal, claiming the lives of some 100-200 people. The authorities, weak and terrified, did nothing to stop it. And yet, just as the revolution seemed to be descending into a bloody abyss, came a moment of miraculous deliverance. On September 20th, at the Battle of Valmy, a newly organized French army, composed of a mix of old royalist regulars and new revolutionary volunteers, stood its ground against the advancing Prussians. In a steady rain, the French artillery, the best in Europe, unleashed a devastating barrage that halted the Prussian advance. After a brief and indecisive exchange of fire, the Duke of Brunswick, unnerved by the unexpected French resolve, broke off the attack and began a long retreat. Militarily, Valmy was little more than a skirmish, but its psychological impact was immense. It was a stunning victory that saved the revolution. The great German writer Goethe, who was present at the battle, famously told his comrades, "From this place, and from this day forth, begins a new era in the history of the world, and you can say that you were there." The very next day, on September 21, 1792, the newly elected National Convention met for the first time. Buoyed by the news from Valmy, Their very first act was to formally abolish the monarchy. France was declared a republic. The ancient kingdom, which had existed for 1,000 years, was gone. A new, uncertain, and dangerous era had begun, and the first question the new republic would have to face was a grim one. What to do with the man who used to be its king? The new French Republic was born, but its cradle was surrounded by enemies. The victory at Valmy had been a reprieve, not a final triumph, and the infant nation was still locked in a desperate war with the great monarchies of Europe. At home, the divisions that would soon tear the revolution apart were already beginning to show. The National Convention was a battleground for two implacable factions. On one side were the Girondins, who had once been the radical leaders of the Legislative Assembly, but now represented a more moderate, provincial, and legalistic approach to the revolution. Facing them and occupying the higher benches in the Assembly Hall, which earned them the name the Montagnards, or the Mountain, was a group of hardline radicals based in the political clubs of Paris. Led by figures like the fiery orator Georges Danton and the cool ascetic Maximilien Robespierre. The Montagnards were closely allied with the Parisian sans-culottes and believed that the survival of the revolution depended on ruthless, centralized action. And the first and most pressing issue that divided them was the question of the king. Louis XVI, now stripped of his titles and referred to by the revolutionary name Citizen Louis Capet, a reference to his distant medieval ancestor, was being held with his family in the Temple, an old fortress-like prison in Paris. What was to be done with him? The Girondins, for the most part, were deeply reluctant to put him on trial. They were lawyers and men of property, and they feared that executing the king would unleash further anarchy, alienate the provinces, and provoke the unified wrath of all of Europe. They argued for imprisonment, exile, or at the very least, a national referendum to decide his fate, a move they hoped would spare his life. The Montagnards, by contrast, argued that a trial and execution were a political necessity. Their brilliant young ideologue, the handsome and chillingly resolute Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, articulated their position with icy logic. "The king is not an accused person," he declared before the convention. "You have not a sentence to pass for or against a man, but a measure of public safety to take." For Saint-Just and Robespierre, the issue was simple. The king's very existence was a threat to the Republic. As long as he lived, he would be a rallying point for royalists and counter-revolutionaries. His life was incompatible with the life of the new nation. One cannot reign innocently, Saint-Just argued. To be a king was, in itself, a crime against the people. He concluded with a chilling pronouncement. This man must reign or die. Any lingering doubts about the necessity of a trial were erased in November 1792 with a dramatic discovery. A locksmith in Paris came forward and revealed the existence of a secret safe, an armoire de fer, that he had installed for the king in a wall of the Tuileries Palace. When the safe was opened, it was found to contain Louis's secret correspondence. The letters proved what the radicals had suspected all along. The king had been playing a double game. The documents revealed his secret dealings with the émigré nobles, his contacts with foreign powers, and his deep-seated hostility to the very constitution he had sworn to uphold. It was a trove of incriminating evidence that made a trial for treason inevitable. The king's duplicity was now laid bare for all to see. The trial began in December 1792 before the National Convention itself, which acted as both judge and jury. Louis was brought before the assembled deputies to hear the charges against him. Observers noted his calm, dignified, and somewhat detached demeanor. He was accused of a long list of crimes against the nation, from plotting against the revolution in its early days to the massacre of the citizens at the storming of the Tuileries. He defended himself intelligently, arguing that his actions had always been within the bounds of his constitutional authority. But the trial was less a legal proceeding than a political show. His guilt was a foregone conclusion. The real debate was over the punishment. In mid-January 1793, the convention held a dramatic marathon session to vote on the king's fate. The voting was done by a roll call, with each of the 749 deputies required to stand up one by one and publicly declare his verdict and his chosen sentence. For 24 hours, the tense process unfolded in a hall, packed with spectators who cheered for death and hissed at any sign of moderation. The first vote, on the question of guilt, was nearly unanimous. The second vote, on whether the sentence should be put to a popular referendum, was narrowly defeated by the Montagnards, who feared the provinces would vote to spare the king. The final crucial vote was on the penalty. The hall was electric with tension as the deputies cast their votes for imprisonment, exile, or death. When the final tally was announced, the margin was shockingly narrow. The death penalty passed by a single vote in some counts, though the final, more complex tally showed a small but clear majority in favor of immediate, unconditional execution. Among those who voted for death was the king's own cousin, Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans, who had adopted the revolutionary name Philippe Égalité, a vote that shocked even some of the hardline radicals. On the cold, foggy morning of January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was taken in a carriage through the silent streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine stood waiting. A huge crowd had gathered. He mounted the scaffold with a firm step, his demeanor calm and composed. He attempted to give a final speech to the crowd, his voice ringing out. "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed may never be visited upon France." But the commander of the National Guard, Antoine-Joseph Santerre, ordered a drum roll, and the rest of his words were drowned out. He was strapped to the plank, the heavy blade fell, and the executioner held up the head of the former king to the cheering crowd. The execution of Citizen Capet was a point of no return. It was an act that horrified the courts of Europe and united them in a grand coalition against the regicide republic. At home, it irrevocably deepened the divisions within France, making civil war all but inevitable. The revolution had killed its king, and in doing so had declared war on the old world, both at home and abroad. The execution of the king was meant to unify the republic, but it did the exact opposite. It was a gauntlet thrown down, an act of defiance that plunged France into the darkest and most desperate chapter of its revolution. The spring and summer of 1793 were a time of existential crisis, a period when the young republic seemed on the verge of being torn apart by a perfect storm of external invasion and internal rebellion. The monarchies of Europe, horrified by the act of regicide, now joined the war against France in a grand coalition. Great Britain, Spain, and the Dutch Republic entered the conflict, and the ring of enemies surrounding the nation was now complete. The French armies, overstretched and demoralized, began to suffer a series of crushing defeats, and the threat of foreign invasion loomed larger than ever. At the same time, the nation was imploding from within. The economy was in free fall. The government's relentless printing of assignats to pay for the war had led to rampant inflation, making the paper currency almost worthless. Prices for food and basic goods soared, leading to bread riots and widespread social unrest among the sans-culottes in Paris, who demanded price controls and harsh measures against hoarders and speculators. The most dangerous internal threat, however, came from the West. In the deeply Catholic and royalist region of the Vendée, the Convention's order for a national draft, a levy of 300,000 men to fight the foreign war, was the final straw. It sparked a massive and brutal peasant uprising that quickly morphed into a full-scale counter-revolutionary civil war. The Vendéan rebels, fighting under the banner of "For God and King," waged a bloody guerrilla campaign against the Republic, creating a savage internal front that drained precious resources and manpower. This atmosphere of crisis brought the simmering political battle in the Convention to a boil. The Girondins, who controlled the government, were blamed for the military defeats and the economic chaos. The Montagnards, led by Robespierre and Danton, allied themselves ever more closely with the radical sans-culottes of Paris, whose demands they channeled into the Assembly. They accused the Girondins of being weak, indecisive, and secretly sympathetic to the king and the provinces. The Girondins, in turn, were horrified by the lawlessness of the Paris mob and accused the Montagnards of aspiring to a bloody dictatorship. The breaking point came on June 2nd, 1793. Tens of thousands of armed sans-culottes, backed by the Paris National Guard, surrounded the Convention and aimed their cannons at the building. They demanded the arrest of the leading Girondin deputies. In a moment that would haunt the revolution, the Convention capitulated to the armed mob. 29 Girondin deputies were purged and placed under house arrest. The Montagnards and the Jacobins now had absolute control of the government. They had won, but they had done so by violating the sanctity of the national representative body, a precedent that would soon be turned against them. To manage this desperate multi-front war, the Convention had, even before the fall of the Girondins, created a new executive body, the Committee of Public Safety. Initially intended as a temporary war council, this committee of 12 men would, over the next year, become the all-powerful de facto government of France. Meeting in secret in a green-carpeted room in the Tuileries Palace, they wielded immense power, controlling the army, the bureaucracy, and the nation's finances. In July, Maximilien Robespierre, the quiet, fastidious lawyer from Arras, known to his followers as the Incorruptible, was elected to the committee. He would soon become its most dominant and emblematic figure. His cool, unwavering belief in the necessity of revolutionary virtue, giving the committee its ideological and moral direction. Faced with foreign invasion, civil war, and economic chaos, the committee and its Montagnard allies in the Convention concluded that only the most extreme measures could save the Republic. Under relentless pressure from the sans-culottes, who were demanding that the traitors who threatened the nation be punished, the Convention declared in September 1793 that terror is the order of the day. This was the official beginning of the Reign of Terror. a year-long period of state-sanctioned violence and political repression that would become the revolution's most infamous and enduring legacy. The logic of the terror was grim and paradoxical. Its architects, like Robespierre, were true believers in the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and reason. They argued that to create a new republic of virtue, a society of good and honest citizens, they first had to purge the nation of all its corrupt and counter-revolutionary elements. Terror, in their view, was a necessary if regrettable tool, a form of emergency medicine to save the sick body of the republic. It was, as Robespierre would later state, an emanation of virtue, the swift and inflexible justice of a people's revolution against its enemies. To carry out this justice, the convention passed a series of draconian laws. The most significant of these was the law of suspects. This decree created an incredibly broad and vague definition of who could be considered an enemy of the revolution. It targeted not just active royalists and rebels, but anyone who, by their conduct, associations, comments, or writings, have shown themselves partisans of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty. This could include people who hadn't shown sufficient enthusiasm for the revolution, merchants who had hoarded goods, or anyone who simply had the wrong family connections. It was a law that made suspicion itself a crime, creating a legal framework for a national witch hunt. To try these suspects, the government empowered the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris and similar bodies in the provinces. These were not ordinary courts of law. They were political weapons. Their proceedings were streamlined. The rights of the accused were severely limited, and the only possible verdicts were acquittal or death. The French Revolution had created a ruthlessly efficient legal machine designed not to weigh evidence, but to eliminate its enemies. The instrument of that elimination, the guillotine, would now begin its grim and relentless work. The symbol of the reign of terror, more than any person or law, was a machine. It stood in the center of Paris, in what was once the Place Louis XV, and had been renamed the Place de la Révolution. It was the guillotine. In the grim theater of the Revolution, it was the star performer. Designed by a committee led by Dr. Antoine Louis and championed by the physician Joseph Ignace Guillotin, the same man, remember, who had suggested the tennis court as a meeting place. It was conceived as an instrument of enlightened humanitarian progress. Before the revolution, executions had been a brutal and unequal spectacle. Nobles had the privilege of a swift beheading by sword, while commoners faced gruesome punishments like hanging, breaking on the wheel, or drawing and quartering. The guillotine, with its heavy, angled blade that fell with swift mechanical precision, was intended to make death instantaneous, painless, and above all, equal. Every citizen, from a king to a common baker, would now face the same national razor. But what began as a symbol of rational egalitarian justice quickly became a symbol of unrelenting industrialized death. Its rhythmic, daily work, a terrifying barometer of the revolution's descent into madness. To be caught in the terror's net was a terrifyingly swift and arbitrary process. It often began with a simple denunciation. A suspicious neighbor, a business rival, a jilted lover. Anyone could write a secret note to the local Revolutionary Surveillance Committee, the Comité de Surveillance, which existed in every neighborhood. These committees, staffed by zealous local patriots, would then decide if the accusation had merit. If it did, The accused would be arrested in the dead of night, their papers seized, their family left in a state of terrified uncertainty. They would be taken to one of the city's overflowing and squalid prisons, places like the Conciergerie, which became known as the antechamber to the guillotine. From there, they would be brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The trial was a theatrical mockery of justice. The public prosecutor, the fearsome Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville, presented the state's case. The accused were given little time to prepare a defense, and witnesses were rarely called. The judges, all staunch Jacobins, saw their role not as impartial arbiters, but as patriots purging the nation of its enemies. The questions were leading, the evidence was flimsy, and the verdict was almost always a foregone conclusion. From the tribunal, the condemned were loaded onto open carts called tumbrils for their final journey through the streets of Paris to the scaffold. This daily procession became a grim piece of public spectacle. Crowds would gather to jeer and insult the prisoners, and a group of women, the infamous tricotesses, supposedly sat by the foot of the guillotine, knitting impassively as the heads fell. The terror consumed people from every walk of life. Its first and most famous victim was the former queen, Marie Antoinette. Her trial in October 1793 was a vicious piece of political theatre. She was accused not just of treason, but of a host of lurid and fabricated crimes, including the monstrous and baseless charge of having sexually abused her own son. She endured the trial with a quiet, regal dignity that even her enemies acknowledged. When she was paraded to the scaffold in an open cart, a sketch by the painter Jacques-Louis David captured her gaunt, aged face and her hands bound behind her back, a stark image of a fallen monarch. Her execution was followed by that of the 21 purged Girondin leaders. They faced their end with defiant courage, reportedly singing the revolutionary anthem, the Marseillaise. As they went to the scaffold one by one, their voices growing fewer and fewer until the last man was silenced. The revolution, in its paranoia, began to devour its own. Olympe de Gouges, the feminist author of the Declaration of the Rights of Woman, was guillotined for her political moderation. Madame Roland, the brilliant woman who had hosted one of the most influential intellectual salons of the Girondin faction, was also executed. As she mounted the scaffold, she uttered the famous last words that perfectly captured the tragic irony of the terror. O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name? This violence was not confined to Paris. In fact, the most extreme and brutal episodes of the terror took place in the provinces, where the government sought to crush counter-revolutionary uprisings with merciless force. The city of Lyon, which had rebelled against the Jacobin government, was made a horrifying example. The convention decreed that Lyon is no more. Its name was to be erased from the map, and its buildings were to be demolished. The guillotine was deemed too slow to deal with the sheer number of condemned prisoners. Instead, hundreds of rebels were marched into open fields, tied together in groups, and mown down by cannon fire in what became known as the mitraillades. In the city of Nantes, the local representative of the convention, Jean-Baptiste Carrier, seeking to crush the remnants of the Vendéen rebellion, devised an even more gruesome method of mass execution. Thousands of prisoners, including priests, nuns, and suspected royalist sympathizers, were loaded onto barges, taken to the middle of the Loire River, and deliberately sunk. These mass drownings, the infamous noyades, became a symbol of the terror at its most depraved. In total, the Reign of Terror claimed an enormous human toll. The official legal executions by the revolutionary tribunals numbered around 17,000 people across all of France. But this figure does not include the tens of thousands who died in the massacres in the provinces, or the hundreds of thousands who perished in the brutal civil war in the Vendée. The Terror was a period of profound national trauma, a time when the noble ideals of 1789 were drowned in a sea of blood and suspicion. It saved the Republic from its immediate military threats, but it did so at a terrible cost, leaving a legacy of bitterness and a stain on the memory of the revolution that would never be fully erased. By the spring of 1794, the Reign of Terror had achieved its primary objectives. The French armies, revitalized by a national draft and a war economy, had turned the tide against the foreign coalition. The Vendéan rebellion had been brutally crushed, and the other Federalist revolts had been suppressed. The Republic, it seemed, was saved. Yet the guillotine in Paris was working faster than ever. The emergency had passed, but the Terror, having developed a logic and momentum of its own, only intensified. The Jacobin government, which had been a monolithic force in its fight against the Girondins, now began to fracture under the immense pressure, splintering into warring factions, each with a different vision of the revolution's future. The revolution was about to turn inward and consume its own leaders in a final bloody act of self-destruction. On the far left were the radical atheists known as the Hébétists, named after their leader, the foul-mouthed and popular journalist Jacques Hébert, publisher of the extremist newspaper Le Père Duchesne. The Hébétists had a strong following among the Parisian sans-culottes and were the driving force behind the dechristianization campaign, which involved closing churches, forcing priests to marry, and promoting the atheistic cult of reason. They demanded ever more radical economic measures, a war to the death against all merchants and the rich, and a further intensification of the terror. On the other side, a new faction of indulgents, or moderates, began to form around Georges Danton. Danton, the charismatic, larger-than-life orator who had rallied the nation against the Prussian invasion, had grown weary of the relentless bloodshed. He and his allies, like the journalist Camille Desmoulins, began to argue that the terror had served its purpose and that it was time to establish a committee of clemency. They believed that the revolution needed to be guided back towards normalcy, to heal its wounds and end the paranoia that was tearing the country apart. "I would rather be guillotined than guillotine others," Danton famously declared, a sentiment that was a direct challenge to the ruling orthodoxy. Caught in the middle was Maximilien Robespierre and his allies on the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre, the incorruptible, despised the atheism and social anarchy of the Hébétists, which he saw as a threat to his vision of an orderly republic of virtue. But he also viewed the indulgence calls for an end to the terror as a dangerous sign of moral weakness and corruption that would allow the revolution's enemies to regroup. To secure his vision of the perfect republic, he concluded that he must first eliminate both of these rival factions. He decided to strike left first. In March 1794, Hébert and his leading followers were suddenly arrested, subjected to a swift show trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and sent to the guillotine. By executing the most popular radical leaders, the committee effectively broke the power of the Parisian sans-culottes. the very mob that had brought them to power in the first place. Then, just 2 weeks later, Robespierre and the committee turned on the right. Danton, Desmoulins, and their allies were arrested on trumped-up charges of financial corruption and conspiracy with foreign powers. Danton's trial was a dramatic spectacle. The great orator, whose voice had once shaken the foundations of the monarchy, fought for his life with all his old fire. But the outcome was never in doubt. The trial was rigged, and he and his followers were condemned. As he was being led to the scaffold, Danton reportedly uttered a prediction to the executioner. "Show my head to the people. It is well worth seeing." His final words were a message for his great rival. "You will follow me, Robespierre." With the execution of the Hébatists and the Dantonists, Robespierre was now the undisputed master of the revolution. He stood alone, his rivals eliminated, his power seemingly absolute. But his position was dangerously isolated. He had silenced the popular voice of the Paris streets and executed the revolution's most beloved and charismatic figures. His power now rested almost entirely on a foundation of fear. In the eerie quiet that followed the purges, Robespierre attempted to impose his own unique moral vision on the nation. A deist who believed in God but detested the Catholic Church, he established a new state religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. It was an abstract, civic religion designed to instill a belief in a benevolent creator and the immortality of the soul, which he believed were the necessary foundations for a virtuous republic. In a bizarre and surreal spectacle on June 8, 1794, he personally presided over the Festival of the Supreme Being in Paris, marching at the head of a great procession dressed in a sky-blue coat, acting as a sort of high priest of his new faith. To many observers, his messianic performance was not inspiring, but deeply unsettling. It looked like the prelude to a personal dictatorship. Just 2 days after this festival, Robespierre pushed a new, terrifying law through the convention, the Law of 22 Prairial. This law dramatically accelerated the terror. It stripped accused prisoners of any right to a defense, left the Revolutionary Tribunal with only 2 possible verdicts, acquittal or death, and allowed convictions based not on evidence, but on the vague moral certainty of the jurors. The result was a horrifying spike in executions. In the 6 weeks before this law, the Paris guillotine had claimed about 500 victims. In the 6 weeks after, it claimed over 1,300. This final, frantic period of bloodshed became known as the Great Terror. But the terror was now consuming itself. The purges had created a pervasive atmosphere of paranoia within the government itself. No one felt safe. The members of the National Convention, who had watched Hébert and Danton be led to their deaths, now began to fear that they would be next. Robespierre, increasingly remote and paranoid, made a fatal error. In a rambling speech before the convention on July 26th, 8th Thermidor, in the new revolutionary calendar, he spoke of a new plot against the Republic and claimed he had a new list of traitors, but he refused to name them. This vague threat was a death sentence for the conspiracy that would overthrow him. Every deputy in the hall, fearing his own name might be on that secret list, now had a personal incentive to strike first. The next day, 9th Thermidor, July 27, 1794, when Robespierre and his ally Saint-Just rose to speak, they were shouted down. A prearranged chorus of deputies began yelling, "Down with the tyrant!" The convention, in a sudden and dramatic reversal, voted for the arrest of Robespierre, his brother Augustin, Saint-Just, and their key allies. They were taken away, but the Paris Commune, still loyal to Robespierre, managed to free them and brought them to the Hôtel de Ville, hoping to rally the sans-culottes for one last stand. But the people of Paris did not rise. The execution of Hébert had broken their spirit. In the early hours of the morning, troops loyal to the convention stormed the city hall. Robespierre was found with his jaw shattered by a pistol shot. Whether it was a suicide attempt or a wound from the raid is still a historical mystery. The next afternoon, the architect of the terror, along with 21 of his closest followers, was taken to the Place de la Révolution and guillotined without trial. The reign of terror was over. The fall of Robespierre on 9th of Thermidor was not initially intended to end the revolution, only to end the terror's stranglehold on the politicians themselves. The men who overthrew him, the Thermidorians, were not royalists or moderates. They were fellow Jacobins and former terrorists who had acted out of self-preservation. But the wave of public revulsion against the reign of terror that followed Robespierre's death was so powerful that it swept them along, leading to a period of dramatic political and social reversal, known as the Thermidorian reaction. France, exhausted by the relentless demands of revolutionary virtue and bloodshed, now swung sharply in a more conservative and chaotic direction. The first and most urgent task was to dismantle the machinery of the terror. The law of 22 Prairial was immediately repealed. The Revolutionary Tribunal was gradually stripped of its powers and eventually abolished. The dreaded Committee of Public Safety was reduced to a mere subcommittee with limited authority. The doors of the prisons were thrown open, releasing tens of thousands of suspects who had been awaiting their turn on the tumbrils. The Jacobin Club, the fanatical heart of the Montagnard government, was closed down, and its leaders were arrested or driven into hiding. It was a wholesale repudiation of the Robespierrist state. This political shift was mirrored by a dramatic cultural transformation. The austere, puritanical Republic of Virtue gave way to a sudden explosion of conspicuous consumption, pleasure-seeking, and social extravagance. A new youth culture emerged, the jeunesse dorée, or gilded youth. Gangs of upper-middle-class young men who dressed in foppish, exaggerated fashions with high collars and long pigtails. They roamed the streets of Paris, armed with heavy canes, engaging in street brawls with the remaining Jacobins and leading the charge to tear down revolutionary symbols like the red liberty cap. Theaters reopened with frivolous plays and lavish balls were held, the most famous being the grotesque Bals des Victimes, or victims' balls, where only people who had lost a relative to the guillotine were allowed to attend, often wearing a thin red ribbon around their necks in a morbid imitation of the blade's cut. It was a society emerging from a collective trauma, desperate to forget the recent past and indulge in the pleasures of the present. This reaction also had a much uglier side. In the provinces, a white terror broke out, a wave of vigilante violence and revenge killings as royalists and the families of victims hunted down and murdered former Jacobin officials and local terrorists, while the rich celebrated, the poor starved. The Thermidorian government, dominated by the propertied bourgeoisie, swiftly dismantled the economic controls of the Jacobin era. They abolished the maximum, the system of price controls on bread and other essential goods. The result was catastrophic for the urban working class. The value of the assignat plummeted, and inflation spiraled out of control. A devastatingly harsh winter in 1794 to 95 led to famine conditions even worse than those of 1789. Once again, the cry for bread echoed through the streets of Paris. In the spring of 1795, the sans-culottes staged one last desperate uprising. In the prairial uprising, they stormed the hall of the National Convention, demanding bread and the Constitution of 1793, the radical Jacobin constitution that had been drafted but never implemented. They even managed to murder one of the deputies, parading his head on a pike through the chamber. But this time, there were no sympathetic Jacobins in power to support them. The convention called in the army, which, for the first time, used overwhelming force to crush the popular uprising. The working-class districts were surrounded and disarmed. The prairial uprising was the final, definitive political defeat of the sans-culottes. The popular street politics that had driven the revolution forward since the fall of the Bastille was over. The power of the mob had been broken, having secured their power against both the Jacobin left and the Parisian crowd. The Thermidorians set about creating a new constitution that would cement their vision of a stable bourgeois republic and prevent a return to either royalist tyranny or radical democracy. The Constitution of the Year 3, 1795, was a deeply conservative document. It placed power firmly back in the hands of the propertied classes by reintroducing a tax-based qualification for voting, effectively disenfranchising the majority of the adult male population to prevent the rise of another dictator like Robespierre. It created a system of checks and balances. The legislature was split into two houses: a lower house, the Council of 500, which would propose laws, and an upper house of older members, the Council of Ancients, which would approve or reject them. Executive power was vested in a 5-man committee known as the Directory. These 5 directors, chosen by the legislature, were meant to provide stable leadership, but the system of annual rotations and the potential for infighting often led to paralysis and intrigue. The new constitution was immediately challenged, not from the left, but from the right. Parisian royalists, believing the revolution had exhausted itself, saw an opportunity to restore the monarchy. In October 1795, 13 Vendémiaire, in the revolutionary calendar, a large royalist mob marched on the convention, seeking to overthrow the new government before it could even take power. The defense of the convention was entrusted to a young and still relatively unknown artillery general who happened to be in the city, Napoleon Bonaparte. With characteristic ruthlessness and efficiency, Bonaparte lined up his cannons and, when the royalist columns advanced, he dispersed them with what he would later famously call a whiff of grape shot. The streets were cleared in minutes, the uprising crushed. The event was a crucial turning point. It saved the new Directory, but it also demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that the new government's power ultimately rested not on popular support or constitutional legitimacy, but on the bayonets of the army. And it brought the ambitious young general who had saved it to the attention of the new political masters of France. The government of the Directory, established in 1795, was a government of survivors. The 5 directors who held executive power, along with the members of the 2 legislative councils, were mostly moderates and former revolutionaries who had managed to navigate the treacherous currents of the Terror and emerge with their heads intact. Their primary goal was to maintain a precarious middle ground, to prevent a return to either the Jacobin radicalism of the left or the royalist reaction of the right. The result was a 4-year period of chronic instability, corruption, and political intrigue. The government was constantly beset by conspiracies, struggling with a worthless currency, and propped up by a series of mini-coups that relied on military intervention. This weak and cynical government, born from exhaustion, created the perfect power vacuum for the rise of an extraordinary individual, the man who had saved the Directory at its birth, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was not a product of the old France. He was born Napoleone di Bonaparte in 1769 on the island of Corsica, just a year after it had been annexed by France. He came from a family of minor Corsican nobility and always spoke French with a thick Italian accent. He was, in every sense, an outsider. As a boy, he was sent to military academies in mainland France, where he was a solitary, studious, and often mocked child, looked down upon by his aristocratic French classmates for his provincial origins and his fierce Corsican pride. The revolution was the making of him. The flight of thousands of aristocratic officers created a vacuum in the army, opening up incredible opportunities for rapid promotion based on talent and ambition rather than birth. Napoleon, a brilliant and fiercely ambitious student of artillery and military history, was perfectly poised to seize this opportunity. His first chance to shine came in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon. The crucial southern port city had rebelled against the Jacobin government and had welcomed the British fleet into its harbor. A young Captain Bonaparte, given command of the Revolutionary Army's artillery, devised a brilliant and audacious plan. He realized that by seizing the high ground overlooking the harbor, he could rain down cannon fire on the British ships, forcing them to evacuate. His plan worked to perfection. Toulon was recaptured, and the young captain, who had been wounded in the thigh during the assault, was hailed as a hero. His performance caught the eye of Augustin Robespierre, Maximilian's younger brother, and he was promoted to the rank of brigadier general at the age of just 24. After a brief period of uncertainty following Robespierre's fall, his decisive crushing of the Royalist uprising in Paris in 1795, the famous whiff of grape shot, made him a household name and the favored general of the new Directory. The directors, however, were nervous. Napoleon was popular, charismatic, and alarmingly ambitious. They wanted to get him out of Paris. In 1796, they offered him command of the French army of Italy. It was considered a secondary front, a ragged and poorly supplied force that was meant to create a minor diversion while the main French armies attacked Austria through Germany. For Napoleon, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He arrived to find an army that was demoralized, underfed, and unpaid. But in his first address to his troops, he electrified them with a promise of glory and riches. "Soldiers," he declared, "you are naked, ill-fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." What followed was one of the most stunning and brilliant military campaigns in history. Napoleon's strategic genius was unlike anything the old armies of Europe had ever seen. He abandoned the slow, methodical warfare of the 18th century and moved with lightning speed, marching his army at a pace that constantly bewildered his Austrian and Piedmontese opponents. His core principle was the concentration of force. He would keep his army divided to move quickly, but would then converge with overwhelming numbers at the decisive point of battle, destroying the enemy's armies one piece at a time. He inspired his men with a combination of easy familiarity and a powerful aura of command. He knew his soldiers by name, shared their hardships, and rewarded bravery on the spot. In a whirlwind campaign, he defeated the armies of Piedmont, forcing them to sue for peace, and then drove the Austrians out of Lombardy, winning a series of dazzling victories at places like the Bridge of Lodi, and most decisively, at the Battle of Rivoli. In Italy, Napoleon behaved less like a general of the Republic and more like a conquering Roman proconsul. He acted with complete independence from the government in Paris. He established new sister republics, like the Cisalpine Republic in northern Italy, with constitutions modeled on that of France. He levied huge financial indemnities on the Italian states, which not only paid for his army, but also sent a river of treasure back to the bankrupt Directory. And he systematically looted Italy's greatest artistic masterpieces, paintings by Raphael and Titian, ancient Roman sculptures, and had them shipped to Paris to be displayed in the Louvre, a symbol of French national glory. Finally, in 1797, he personally negotiated a peace treaty with Austria, the Treaty of Campo Formio, completely redrawing the map of northern Italy and securing a triumphant peace, all without the full consent of his own government. He returned to Paris a conquering hero, his popularity eclipsing that of the 5 directors. Once again, they were desperate to get him away from the center of power. Napoleon, dreaming of emulating Alexander the Great, proposed an even more exotic and ambitious plan: the invasion of Egypt. The strategic goal was to strike at Great Britain's power by threatening its land routes to India. The Directory, delighted at the prospect of sending their brilliant but troublesome general and his veteran army to the far side of the Mediterranean, readily agreed. In 1798, a massive French fleet set sail. The campaign began with a swift victory. Napoleon's army captured Malta and then landed in Egypt, defeating the Mamluk cavalry at the famous Battle of the Pyramids. But just a few weeks later, the British Admiral Horatio Nelson located the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay, and in a stunning naval victory at the Battle of the Nile, completely annihilated it. Napoleon had conquered Egypt, but he and his entire army were now trapped, cut off from France by the dominant British Navy. The great conqueror's Eastern dream had turned into a gilded prison. While Napoleon was isolated in Egypt, conducting fruitless campaigns in the sands of Syria and overseeing the cataloguing of ancient ruins, the government he served was once again crumbling. By 1799, the Directory was deeply unpopular, bankrupt, and widely seen as hopelessly corrupt. A new second coalition of European powers, led by Austria and Russia, had formed against France, and its armies were inflicting a series of major defeats on the French forces in Italy and Germany. The sister republics that Napoleon had established were collapsing, and France itself was once again facing the threat of invasion. At home, political instability was endemic. The annual elections were a constant source of turmoil, and the government was lurching between crackdowns on royalist plots on the right and Jacobin revivals on the left. The nation was weary of a decade of revolution, war, and political chaos. There was a deep and growing desire for stability, for a leader who could restore order and secure the gains of the revolution. Within the government itself, a powerful group of conspirators had come to the same conclusion. They believed that the Directory, with its weak executive and factious legislature, was incapable of saving the Republic. They decided that the only solution was a coup d'etat, a swift and illegal seizure of power to force through a new, more authoritarian constitution. The intellectual leader of this plot was a familiar name, the Abbé Sieyès, the man whose pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, had ignited the revolution back in 1789. Now, a decade later, Sieyès was one of the 5 directors, and his faith in popular democracy had been completely shattered. He had drafted a new constitution that would concentrate power in the hands of a strong executive, but he knew the legislative councils would never vote themselves out of existence. He needed a sword, a popular and loyal general who could provide the military muscle to intimidate the politicians and secure the coup. Just as the plot was taking shape, news arrived in France that seemed like a miracle. Napoleon Bonaparte had landed. Having learned of the crisis at home, Napoleon had made a risky and decisive move. He had abandoned his army in Egypt, leaving it under the command of a subordinate, and had secretly boarded a small, fast ship. In a journey that was part luck and part daring, he had managed to evade the patrolling British fleet and land on the southern coast of France in October 1799. The failure of his Egyptian campaign and the fact that he had technically deserted his post were conveniently ignored. To the French people, his return was seen as an act of providence. He was hailed not as a deserter, but as the nation's savior, the one man who could defeat France's enemies and restore its glory. His journey from the coast to Paris was a triumphant procession. When Napoleon arrived in the capital, he was immediately approached by the conspirators. He was their perfect sword. A secret alliance was formed between the ambitious general and the scheming politician. Together, they planned the overthrow of the very government Napoleon was sworn to defend. The date was set for 18 Brumaire in the year 8th of the revolutionary calendar, or November 9th, 1799. The coup began smoothly. In the early morning, the Council of Ancients, the upper house of the legislature, where the conspirators had the most influence, was convened. They were told of a fabricated Jacobin plot to overthrow the Republic. In the ensuing panic, the council voted on 2 emergency measures. First, to relocate both legislative councils for their safety to the Palace of Saint-Cloud, just outside the military cordon of Paris, and second, to appoint General Bonaparte as commander of all troops in the capital to protect them from this supposed plot. The first phase had worked perfectly. 2 of the 5 directors, Sieyès and his ally, resigned. The other 3 were placed under house arrest. The executive was paralyzed, and Napoleon now controlled the army. The next day, 19 Brumaire, the plan began to fall apart. The deputies of the 2 councils gathered at Saint-Cloud, but the delay had given them time to think. They grew suspicious of the vague Jacobin plot and began to sense that they were the real targets. The Council of 500, the lower house filled with fiery and unpredictable Jacobins, was in an uproar. Napoleon, who was a master of the battlefield but a novice at parliamentary politics, decided he needed to address them personally. It was a disastrous miscalculation. When he entered the chamber of the Council of Ancients, his nervous, rambling speech was met with skepticism. He then went to the far more hostile Council of 500. As soon as he entered, the deputies erupted in furious shouts of, "Down with the dictator!" Outlaw him. They surrounded him, grabbing him by the collar, shoving him, and accusing him of being a new Caesar. The great general, who had faced down Austrian cannons without flinching, was completely overwhelmed by this verbal and physical assault. He grew pale, nearly fainted, and had to be dragged out of the chamber by his grenadiers. The coup was on the verge of collapse. Napoleon was shaken, and the deputies were about to vote to declare him an outlaw, which would have meant his arrest and execution. The day was saved by his younger brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who, in a stroke of incredible luck for the plotters, happened to be the serving president of the Council of 500. As the deputies raged inside, Lucien rushed out to the palace courtyard, where the soldiers tasked with guarding the legislature were waiting. He mounted a horse, drew his sword, and delivered the performance of his life. He told the soldiers that the vast majority of the council was being terrorized by a small group of deputies who were in the pay of the English and who had tried to assassinate their general with daggers, pointing his sword dramatically at his brother's chest. He swore that he would be the first to kill Napoleon if he ever betrayed the principles of the revolution. This theatrical lie was all the justification the wavering soldiers needed. Led by a cavalry commander named Joachim Murat, the grenadiers fixed their bayonets, marched to the beat of a drum, and stormed the legislative chamber. As the soldiers poured in, the deputies, the elected representatives of the French nation, scattered in panic, climbing out of windows and disappearing into the woods. The French Revolution's 10-year experiment with parliamentary democracy was over, dispersed by the force of bayonets. That evening, a rump of the remaining deputies was rounded up to formally abolish the Directory and appoint 3 provisional consuls to run the state: CAS, another director, and of course, Napoleon Bonaparte. Everyone knew who was really in charge. The revolution that had begun with a cry for liberty had ended with the silent tread of marching soldiers. The coup of 18 Brumaire had succeeded, but the new government was a clumsy 3-headed creature. The provisional consuls, Napoleon, CAS, and another man named Roger Ducos, were tasked with writing yet another constitution, the 4th in a decade. CAS, the veteran political theorist, believed his moment had finally come. He presented a complex, elaborate design for a government of checks and balances, a system designed to prevent the emergence of any single powerful dictator. It featured a grand elector, a purely ceremonial head of state, and a series of councils to diffuse power. Napoleon, however, had no intention of being a ceremonial figurehead or sharing power with anyone. With a combination of sharp political maneuvering and sheer force of will, he took CAS's intricate blueprint, thanked him for his work, and completely rewrote it to serve his own ambitions. The resulting constitution of the year 8 was a masterpiece of disguised autocracy. It paid lip service to the idea of popular sovereignty, but was designed to concentrate all real authority in the hands of one man. It established a government called the consulate. At its head were 3 consuls, but this was a deliberate illusion of shared power. The 2nd and 3rd consuls had only a consultative voice. All executive power, the ability to appoint ministers, to control the army, to propose laws, was vested in the 1st consul, and the constitution, of course, named Napoleon Bonaparte to that position for a term of 10 years. The legislature was a shadow of its former self, broken up into 3 different bodies, with confusing and overlapping roles, all designed to be weak and subservient to the will of the first consul. The people's right to vote was preserved in theory, but it was rendered meaningless by a system of indirect election so convoluted that it had no real impact on the makeup of the government. Napoleon was a brilliant propagandist, and he understood that his rule needed the appearance of popular consent. He submitted his new constitution to a plebiscite, a direct up or down vote by the people. The results, announced in February 1800, were a staggering success. Over 3 million Frenchmen had voted in favor, with only about 1,500 against. While it's almost certain that his brother Lucien, now the Minister of the Interior, had adjusted the results to make them look more impressive, the vote nevertheless reflected a genuine national sentiment. The French people were exhausted by 10 years of revolutionary turmoil. They craved order, stability, and a leader who could guarantee the core gains of the revolution: equality before the law, the abolition of feudalism, and the security of property, while putting an end to the chaos, the factionalism, and the bloodshed. They were more than willing to trade the messy business of political liberty for the promise of a strong, effective government. Napoleon was offering to be the man who would end the revolution, and the nation gratefully accepted. His first priority as first consul was to end the war that was once again threatening France's borders. The second coalition was still active, and the Austrians had reconquered much of Italy. In a move that captured the imagination of Europe, Napoleon decided to repeat his earlier triumphs. In the spring of 1800, he led his army on a daring and arduous march through the treacherous Great St. Bernard Pass in the Alps, emulating the ancient Carthaginian general Hannibal. He descended into Italy, catching the Austrian army completely by surprise. The decisive engagement came on June 14, 1800, at the Battle of Marengo. It was a close-run thing. By the middle of the afternoon, the French army was on the verge of defeat, but a timely arrival of reinforcements and a perfectly executed cavalry charge turned the tide of battle into a stunning French victory. Marengo solidified Napoleon's military reputation and his political power at home. Austria was forced to the negotiating table, signing the Treaty of Luneville in 1801, which reaffirmed French control over Italy and the west bank of the Rhine. A year later, in 1802, he achieved an even greater prize, signing the Peace of Amiens with Great Britain. For the first time in a decade, the guns fell silent. Europe was at peace. While his armies were securing peace abroad, Napoleon was working with tireless energy to secure peace at home, healing the deep wounds that had torn French society apart. He offered a general amnesty to the aristocratic émigrés, allowing tens of thousands of them to return to France, provided they swore an oath of loyalty to the new regime. This act helped to end the internal war against the nobility and brought much-needed talent and experience back into the country. His most brilliant act of reconciliation was the Concordat of 1801, a landmark agreement with the Pope that ended the bitter, decade-long schism between the French state and the Catholic Church. Remember, the civil constitution of the clergy had been one of the Revolution's greatest mistakes. Napoleon, though not a particularly religious man himself, was a pragmatist who understood the power of faith. Society is impossible without inequality, he once remarked. Inequality is impossible without a morality, and morality is impossible without religion. He saw the church not as an enemy, but as a useful pillar of social order, a social glue. The Concordat was a masterful compromise. The Pope agreed to recognize the French Republic and, crucially, accepted the permanent loss of the church lands that had been sold off during the Revolution. In return, the French government recognized Catholicism not as the state religion, but as the religion of the great majority of Frenchmen. It also agreed to pay the salaries of the clergy, who would be nominated by the state but consecrated by the Pope. The Concordat pacified the rebellious Catholic regions, ended the counter-revolution, and brought millions of devout French citizens back into the national fold. It was a classic Napoleonic solution, pragmatic, authoritarian, and designed to bring a fractious institution firmly under the control of the state. Through military victory and shrewd political reconciliation, the first consul was rapidly transforming himself from a mere general into the undisputed master of France. Having secured France's borders and pacified its internal religious conflicts, Napoleon turned his boundless energy to a project that was, in many ways, more ambitious than any military campaign: the creation of a single, unified legal code for all of France. It would become his most enduring and far-reaching legacy, a monumental achievement that would outlast all of his battlefield victories. Before the Revolution, the legal landscape of France had been a bewildering and chaotic jungle. A popular saying claimed that a traveler in France changed laws as often as he changed horses. The north of the country operated under a system of customary law, a patchwork of hundreds of different local customs derived from old Germanic traditions. The South, by contrast, operated under a system based on ancient Roman law. On top of this fundamental division were layers of feudal law, church canon law, and special royal ordinances, all of which often contradicted one another. The Revolution had, in theory, swept this all away with the promise of one law for all. But a decade of turmoil had prevented the creation of a new, comprehensive system. Napoleon saw this legal chaos as an obstacle to national unity and efficient governance. He wanted a single set of clear, rational, and accessible laws that would apply to every citizen, from the English Channel to the Mediterranean. It was a classic Enlightenment project, and he pursued it with his characteristic speed and determination. In 1800, he appointed a commission of 4 eminent jurists to draft the new civil code. But unlike most rulers, he did not simply delegate the task. He became an active and obsessive participant in the process. Of the more than 100 sessions held by the Council of State to debate the draft, Napoleon personally presided over more than half of them. He would arrive at the meetings, often late at night, after a full day of other government business, and throw himself into the complex legal debates with astonishing energy and intellect. He was not a lawyer, but his mind was sharp, pragmatic, and impatient with abstract legal theory. He constantly cut through the jurist's technical jargon, demanding clarity and common sense. "Explain it to me as if I were a simple family man," he would insist. He brought his soldier's mind to the task, seeking to create a code that was like a well-drilled army, orderly, efficient, and unambiguous. The finished work, promulgated in 1804 as the Civil Code of the French, and later renamed the Napoleonic Code, was a brilliant synthesis of the old and the new. It was, first and foremost, a revolutionary document that cemented into permanent law the great principles of 1789. Its foundational tenet was equality before the law. All the old privileges of the nobility and clergy were gone forever. All Frenchmen were now equal citizens in the eyes of the court. It enshrined the right of individuals to choose their own profession, formally burying the restrictive medieval guild system. It guaranteed freedom of conscience, reaffirming the principle of religious tolerance. But its most important revolutionary legacy was its ferocious protection of private property. The code made the ownership of property an absolute, sacred, and inviolable right. This was a crucial move that reassured the two groups who had gained the most from the revolution, the bourgeoisie and the peasantry. It guaranteed that their ownership of the lands and properties they had purchased from the nationalized holdings of the church and the émigré nobility would be protected by the full force of the state forever. It was, in this sense, the legal bedrock of the new bourgeois France. However, the code was also a deeply conservative and patriarchal document that reflected Napoleon's own authoritarian views on social order. While it enshrined the legal equality of men, it took a dramatic step backward in its treatment of women. The more liberal revolutionary laws on family and divorce were thrown out. The code placed the family under the absolute authority of the husband and father. A wife was legally subordinate to her husband. She could not sign a contract, run a business, or sell property without his permission. The grounds for divorce were severely restricted, especially for women. A husband could sue for divorce for a single act of adultery, while a wife could only do so if her husband brought his mistress to live in their family home. The code explicitly stated, a husband owes protection to his wife, a wife obedience to her husband. Children, too, were placed under the absolute authority of their father until they came of age. In its approach to the family, the Napoleonic Code was not revolutionary at all. It was a return to the patriarchal traditions of ancient Rome, creating a rigid, hierarchical family structure that Napoleon believed was the essential foundation for a stable and orderly state. The historical impact of the Napoleonic Code is almost impossible to overstate. It provided France with a unified, modern legal system that, with some modifications, remains the basis of its law to this day. But its influence spread far beyond France's borders. As Napoleon's armies conquered Europe, they brought the code with them. It was imposed on or adopted by vast territories, including Belgium, Luxembourg, parts of Germany and Italy, and the Netherlands. It swept away the tangled remnants of feudal law in much of the continent, replacing it with a single, rational system. Even after Napoleon's fall, the code often remained in place, a permanent legacy of the French occupation. Its clarity and logic were so admired that it became the model for the legal systems of more than 20 nations around the world, from Poland in Europe to Egypt in the Middle East, Japan in Asia, and nearly all of Latin America. The French Revolution's most successful and enduring export was not, in the end, the guillotine or the radicalism of the Jacobins, but the quiet, rational, and profoundly influential pages of Napoleon's great legal code. Napoleon's rule as First Consul had brought France a period of peace, stability, and remarkable institutional achievement. He had ended the wars, healed the religious divide, and given the nation a unified legal code. His popularity was immense. He was seen by most Frenchmen as the savior of the nation, the man who had consolidated the best parts of the revolution while putting a definitive end to its destructive chaos. But for a man of Napoleon's boundless ambition, being a temporary first consul, even for a 10-year term, was not enough. He sought a power that was not just absolute, but permanent, using a series of royalist assassination plots against him as a pretext. He argued that his life was constantly under threat, and that if he were to be killed, the nation would descend back into chaos. The only way to guarantee stability, his supporters claimed, was to make his rule a lifelong position. In 1802, another plebiscite was held, and the French people, once again choosing order over liberty, voted overwhelmingly to make Napoleon Bonaparte first consul for life, with the right to name his successor. The Republic was now a monarchy in all but name. The final transformation from a republic to a dynastic empire was driven by a combination of Napoleon's personal ambition and his cold political calculation. In 1804, another major royalist conspiracy to assassinate him was uncovered. Napoleon, enraged and determined to send a ruthless message to his Bourbon enemies, decided on an act of calculated state terror. His police informed him that a Bourbon prince, the young Duke d'Enghien, was living just across the border in the neutral German state of Baden, and was believed to be involved in the plot. In a flagrant violation of international law, Napoleon sent a commando unit of French dragoons to cross the Rhine, kidnap the prince, and bring him back to Paris. The Duke was innocent of the specific plot, but that didn't matter. He was given a secret, summary court-martial in the middle of the night at the Château de Vincennes, and was executed by a firing squad in the castle's moat just before dawn. The execution of the Duc d'Enghien sent a shockwave of horror through the royal courts of Europe, who saw it as a gangster-like murder. But it served two very specific purposes for Napoleon. First, it sent a clear and brutal message to the Bourbons that he would stop at nothing to protect his power. Second, and more subtly, it was a message to the old revolutionaries in France. By shedding Bourbon blood, Napoleon had irrevocably broken with the old dynasty. He was signaling to the men who had voted for the death of Louis XVI that there could be no going back. They could never trust a restored Bourbon king to forgive them. Their only security, he implied, lay in tying their fortunes permanently to his own. He had made himself the only alternative to a royalist restoration. With the threat of plots and assassinations still in the air, the argument was once again made that only a hereditary system could secure the future. If Napoleon's rule became a dynasty, his death would not matter, as his heir would simply succeed him, thus making any assassination attempt pointless. In May 1804, the Senate, a body packed with Napoleon's loyal followers, formally petitioned him to accept a new title. On May 18th, a new constitution was proclaimed, declaring that the government of the Republic was now entrusted to an emperor. The French Republic was dead. The First French Empire was born. The choice of title was deliberate and brilliant. He did not call himself king, a title stained by the memory of feudalism and the weak Louis XVI. He chose emperor, a title that evoked the glory of ancient Rome and the legacy of Charlemagne, suggesting a power that was modern, military, and pan-European. And he was to be Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, a title that, like King of the French before it, maintained the crucial fiction that his power emanated from the people, not from divine right. The grand climax of this transformation came on December 2nd, 1804, in a coronation ceremony of breathtaking magnificence held at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Napoleon was determined to create an instant and unforgettable spectacle of dynastic legitimacy. He summoned Pope Pius VII from Rome to preside over the ceremony, seeking the ultimate religious consecration for his new regime. But he was also determined to show that he was not a creature of the church. The cathedral was decorated in a lavish, neoclassical, empire style, and the ceremony itself was a carefully choreographed piece of political theatre. As the moment of coronation arrived, the Pope prepared to lift the crown and place it on the emperor's head. But in a gesture of astonishing and pre-planned audacity, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands, turned his back to the altar, and facing the congregation, placed it on his own head. He then took a second crown and placed it on the head of his wife, Josephine, whom he crowned as Empress. The symbolism was unmistakable and profound. By crowning himself, Napoleon was making a clear and powerful statement. His authority did not come from God or from the church, but from his own military and political achievements, and from the will of the French people. The Pope was reduced to a mere spectator, a prop in a drama directed by Napoleon himself. The ceremony was a brilliant fusion of different historical traditions. The presence of the Pope evoked the coronations of the old French kings. The laurel wreath on Napoleon's head evoked the Caesars of Rome, and the whole affair was a celebration of a man who had risen to the pinnacle of power through the revolutionary principle of a career open to talents. To complete his new imperial order, Napoleon created a new court and a new nobility. He established the Legion of Honor as the highest order of the state, rewarding distinguished service, both military and civilian. He appointed his family members as princes and princesses of the empire, and created a new imperial nobility, dukes, counts, and barons, bestowed not on the basis of ancient lineage, but as a reward for loyalty and service to the emperor. It was a strange and contradictory creation, an absolute hereditary monarchy that was, at its core, built upon the revolutionary premise that a man's worth should be determined by his talent and his achievements, not by his birth. The Corsican artillery officer, the child of the revolution, was now the equal of any king in Europe, and the long, tumultuous journey that had begun in the halls of Versailles had ended with an imperial throne. The coronation of Napoleon as Emperor of the French in 1804 is, for most historians, the moment the curtain finally falls on the French Revolution. The chaotic 10-year drama that had begun with an oath in a tennis court and had led the nation through a republic, a reign of terror, and a sputtering directory, now ended with the restoration of a hereditary, absolute monarchy. On the surface, it seemed as though the revolution had come full circle, that the great struggle for liberty had ended in failure, simply replacing a Bourbon king with a Corsican emperor. But to see it that way is to miss the profound and irreversible transformations that had taken place. Napoleon's empire was not the ancien regime. The old world had been shattered beyond repair, and the legacy of the revolution, a complex and often contradictory inheritance of ideas and institutions, had already begun to reshape not just France, but the entire world. The most immediate and undeniable legacy was the complete destruction of the old feudal order in France. The intricate pyramid of corporate privilege, with its 3 estates, its tax-exempt nobles, and its powerful clergy, was gone forever. The August Decrees and the Napoleonic Code had created a new, modern society based, at least in theory, on the principle of legal equality. A man's position was no longer determined by his birth, but by his talent and his property. This was the great triumph of the bourgeoisie, the class that had, in many ways, both started and ended the revolution. They had secured a society where property was sacred, careers were open to talent, and the law applied equally to all, creating the social and legal framework for the development of 19th century capitalism. The revolution also gave birth to modern politics. It was in the heated debates of the National Assembly that the very terms left and right were born, based on the seating arrangements of the radical Jacobins who sat to the president's left and the more conservative monarchists who sat to his right. The revolution was a crucible of political ideologies. It gave the world its first real taste of liberalism, with its emphasis on constitutional government and individual rights. It spawned modern conservatism in reaction to its excesses, articulated most famously by the British writer Edmund Burke, and it created a powerful new tradition of revolutionary radicalism, the belief that society could be completely remade from the ground up according to a rational plan. The political clubs, the explosion of popular newspapers and pamphlets, and the constant feverish public debate created a new public sphere, a space where the affairs of the nation were the business of every citizen, not just the secret domain of the king and his ministers. And at the heart of this new political culture was the powerful transformative idea of popular sovereignty, the belief that the ultimate source of all political authority is not God or a dynasty, a king or an emperor, but the people themselves. Flowing directly from this was the emergence of modern nationalism. Before 1789, a peasant in Provence and a merchant in Paris had little in common besides their shared obedience to the same king. Their identity was local and regional. The revolution forged these disparate groups into a single, unified nation. Being a French citizen became a powerful new identity. This sense of national belonging was forged in the heat of battle. The threat of foreign invasion, the call for the levée en masse, the universal draft that called on all citizens to defend la patrie, the fatherland, and the singing of the new stirring national anthem, the Marseillaise, all created a powerful, emotional bond of national unity that had never existed before. This new, potent force of a people in arms, fighting not for a king, but for their nation, would prove to be one of the revolution's most powerful and often dangerous exports. Of course, the legacy of the revolution is a dual one, a story of both light and darkness. Its bright, enduring legacy is the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen. Its proclamation of universal rights, liberty, equality, property, and security, became the foundational text for liberal democracy around the world. Every subsequent struggle for human rights, from the feminist movement to the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, would owe an intellectual debt to the principles first articulated in 1789. But this legacy of liberty is forever shadowed by the dark legacy of the Reign of Terror. The Terror provided a terrifying new blueprint for modern state power. It demonstrated how a small, determined group of ideologues could seize control of the state and use its centralized power to impose a utopian vision on society through violence and fear. The Committee of Public Safety, with its surveillance committees, its political show trials, and its use of terror as a deliberate instrument of government policy, was a chilling prequel to the totalitarian states of the 20th century. The revolution thus left the world with a profound and troubling question. How does a society defend liberty without descending into anarchy? And how does it achieve order without sacrificing that very liberty? This complex inheritance was carried across Europe by Napoleon's armies. As they conquered, they brought with them the Napoleonic Code, the abolition of feudalism, and the principles of legal equality. They were both liberators and conquerors, sweeping away the old medieval order while imposing French domination. The revolution's ideas inspired liberal and nationalist movements across the continent, from Germany and Italy to Poland and Spain. Further afield, its example ignited the slave revolt in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which would become the independent nation of Haiti, and it inspired the leaders of the independence movements in Latin America, like Simón Bolívar. The French Revolution was not just a French event, it was a world historical event, the great turning point that, for better and for worse, marks the beginning of the modern age. And so, our long journey through the tumultuous, brilliant, and terrifying years of the French Revolution comes to a close. We have traveled from the glittering, sun-drenched halls of Versailles to the grim, torchlit streets of a Paris in revolt. We have stood with the deputies in a humble tennis court, watched a medieval fortress fall to a citizen mob, and heard the roar of the crowd as a king's head was held aloft. We have witnessed the birth of sublime ideals and the descent into unimaginable terror. And we have followed the path of a young Corsican general as he rose from obscurity to become the master of Europe. The revolution as a historical event was over, its fires banked and its energies channeled into the creation of a new authoritarian empire. But the ideas it unleashed, the questions it raised, and the ghosts it summoned could not be so easily contained. They escaped the borders of France and the confines of their century, and they continue to whisper and argue in the very fabric of our modern world. The revolution's most enduring and universal legacy can be found in its immortal slogan, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Liberty, equality, fraternity. These three words were not just a motto. They were a political program, and the often difficult relationship between them has defined the great ideological struggles of the last 200 years. Liberty, the great cry of 1789, has echoed through every subsequent movement for constitutional government, for the rule of law, and for the protection of individual rights. The liberal tradition, with its emphasis on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom from arbitrary government power, is the direct intellectual heir of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Equality, the great cry of the radical Jacobins in 1793, proved to be a more complex and contentious ideal. While the revolution succeeded in establishing permanent legal equality, the Jacobins' more radical push for social and economic equality, their attempts to control prices, redistribute wealth, and create a republic of virtue, was defeated. Yet, that powerful idea never went away. The dream of a society free from vast disparities of wealth and poverty would become the central inspiration for the great socialist and communist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. The ongoing debate in our own societies about the role of the state in reducing inequality is a direct continuation of the argument that first erupted between the moderate Girondins and the radical Montagnards. And fraternity, the call for all citizens of the nation to see themselves as brothers, became the emotional heart of modern nationalism. It was the powerful force that bound the French people together to defend their homeland, but it also contained a darker potential. The passionate love for one's own nation could all too easily curdle into a suspicion and hatred of others, fueling the aggressive, expansionist nationalisms that would lead Europe into the catastrophic wars of the 20th century. The modern world is still grappling with the tension between these three ideals. How to balance the liberty of the individual with the demand for the equality of the collective, and how to harness the unifying power of fraternity without unleashing the destructive demons of xenophobia. The French Revolution also became a kind of archetypal script for all future revolutions. For revolutionaries and political thinkers who came after, it was the ultimate case study. Karl Marx, in developing his theory of class struggle, drew heavily on the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the sans-culottes. The Russian revolutionaries of 1917, particularly Lenin, were obsessed with the French model. They consciously studied its phases, desperate to avoid the fatal turn of Ninth Thermidor, where the revolution devours its own. They saw their own moderate liberals as Girondins, their Bolsheviks as Jacobins, and they were determined to be more ruthless than Robespierre to avoid his fate. The story of the French Revolution became a pattern, a series of stages: the moderate beginning, the radical turn, the terror, the eventual military consolidation, that political actors in countries from China to Cuba would consciously try to either follow or subvert. And so even now, the whispers of this great upheaval are all around us. They are there in the very language of our politics, in the concepts of left and right, of human rights and national sovereignty. They are present in the ongoing global struggle to build stable democracies, and in the debates we have every day about the proper relationship between the individual and the state. The story of the French Revolution is a timeless and often cautionary tale. It reminds us that the desire for liberty is one of the most powerful forces in human history, but that the path from an old, unjust world to a new, better one is often fraught with unexpected and terrible dangers. It shows us that even the noblest of ideals can be twisted into instruments of oppression, and that the line between a virtuous republic and a reign of terror can be perilously thin. As we end our story, perhaps it is best to picture that single, iconic image from its very beginning. The deputies in the tennis court, their arms outstretched, swearing a solemn oath to create a better world. Their faces are filled with a mixture of hope, determination, and a profound uncertainty about the future they are about to unleash. They could not know the long and winding path their revolution would take, the glory it would achieve, or the horrors it would commit. They only knew that the world they had inherited was no longer acceptable, and that they had the power and the duty to begin it anew. And now, as their story fades into the quiet of the past, may the lessons of their struggle, their triumphs, and their failures guide you into a peaceful and deeply restful sleep.